Dramatis Personae in order of house appearance, the ninth house keepers of the locked tomb house of the sown tongue, the black vestals Hera Hark Nanajazuma's heir to the house of the ninth, Reverend daughter of Dreba Palamona Novenarias, her mother Reverend mother of Dreba Priam Hark Noners Vianus, her father Reverend father of Dreba Otter Sniganed Cavalier primary to the heir Crux, marshal of the house of the ninth, Aglaman captain of the guard of the ninth, sister Lacrimorta none of the locked tomb, sister Isamorta none of the locked tomb, sister Glorica none of the locked tomb, some various followers, cultists, and lay people of the ninth, and Gideon Nav indentured servant of the house of the ninth, the first house Necromancer divine king of the nine renewals, our resurrector, the Necrolord prime, the emperor his lectors, and the priesthood of Canaan house, the second house, the emperor's strength house of the crimson shield, the centurion's house, Judith Deuterus heir to the house of the second ranked captain of the cohort, martyr Deish cavalier primary to the heir ranked first lieutenant of the cohort, the third house, mouse of the emperor, the procession house of the shining dead Corona Beth Tridentarius heir to the house of the third crown princess of Ida, Enth Tridentarius heir to the house of the third princess of Ida, Nibirius turn cavalier primary to the heirs, prince of Ida, the fourth house, hope of the emperor, the emperor's sword Isaac Teterus heir to the house of the fourth baron of Tissus, genre chatter cavalier primary to the heir knights of Tissus, the fifth house, heart of the emperor watches over the river, Abigail Pent heir to the house of the fifth lady of Caniorda's court, Magnus Quinn cavalier primary to the heir seneschal of Caniorda's court, the sixth house, the emperor's reason, the master warden's calamity Sextus heir to the house of the sixth master warden of the library, Camilla Hecht cavalier primary to the heir warden's hand of the library, the seventh house, joy of the emperor, the rose unblown Dulcinea Septimus heir to the house of the seventh duchess of Rhodes, Protesiluas Abduma cavalier primary to the heir knights of Rhodes, the eighth house keepers of the tomb, the forgiving house Silas Octokaiserin heir to the house of the eighth master templar of the white glass column, Ashed cavalier primary to the heir templar of the white glass, two is for discipline heedless of trial, three for the gleam of a jewel or a smile, for fidelity facing ahead, five for tradition and debts to the dead, six for the truth over solace and lies, seven for beauty that blossoms and dies, eight for salvation no matter the cost, nine for the tomb and for all that was lost, Act 1 Chapter 1, in the myriadic year of our Lord, the 10,000th year of the king, undying the kindly prince of death, Gideon Nav packed her sword, her shoes, and her dirty magazines, and she escaped from the house of the ninth. She didn't run, Gideon never ran unless she had to in the absolute darkness before dawn. She brushed her teeth without concern and splashed her face with water, and even went so far as to sweep the dust off the floor of her cell. She shook out her big black church robe and hung it from the hook, having done this every day for over a decade. She no longer needed light to do it by this late in the equinox. No light would make it here for months in any case. You could tell the season by how hard the heating fence were creaking. She dressed herself from head to toe in polymer and synthetic weave. She combed her hair. Ben Gideon whistled through her teeth as she unlocked her security cuff and arranged it and its stolen key considerately on her pillow, like a chocolate in a fancy hotel. Leaving her cell and swinging her pack over one shoulder, she took the time to walk down 5 flights to her mother's nameless catacomb niche. This was pure sentiment, as her mother hadn't been there since Gideon was little and would never go back in it now. Then came the long hike up 22 flights the back way, not one light relieving the greasy dark heading to the split-off shaft in the pit where her ride would arrive. The shuttle was due in 2 hours. Out here, you had an unimpeded view up to a pocket of ninth sky. It was soupy white where the atmosphere was pumped in thickest and thin, and navy where it wasn't. The bright beat of Dominicus winked benignly down from the mouth of the long vertical tunnel. In the dark she made an opening amble of the field's perimeter, and she pressed her hands up hard against the cold and oily rock of the cave walls. Once this was done, she spent a long time methodically kicking apart every single innocuous drift and hammock of dirt and rock that had been left on the worn floor of the landing field. She dug the shabby steel toe of her boot into the hard-packed floor, but satisfied with the sheer improbability of anyone digging through it, left it alone. Not an inch of that huge empty space did Gideon leave unchecked, and as the generator lights crumbled to half-hearted life, she checked it twice by sight. She climbed up the wire meshed frames of the floodlights and checked them, blinded by the glare, feeling blindly behind the metal housing grimly. Comforted by what she didn't find, she parked herself on one of the destroyed humps of rubble in the dead center. The lamps made lackluster any real light. They explosively burst malform shadow. All around, the shades of the ninth were deep and shifty. They were bruised, colored, and cold. In these surrounds, Gideon rewarded herself with a little plastic bag of porridge. It tasted gorgeously gray and horrible. The morning started as every other morning had started in the ninth since the ninth began. She took a turn around the vast landing site just for a change of pace, kicking absently at an untidy drift of grit. As she went, she moved out to the balcony tier and looked down at the central cavern for signs of movement, worrying porridge from her molars with the tip of her tongue. After a while, there was the faraway upward clatter of the skeletons going to pick mindlessly at the snow leaks in the planter fields. Gideon saw them in her mind's eye, mucky ivory in the sulphurous dim picks clattering over the ground eyes, a multitude of wavering red pinpricks. The first bell clanged its uncannerous complaining call for beginning prayers, sounding as always like it was getting kicked down some stairs, a sort of blah blank blah blank blah blank that had woken her up every morning that she could recall. Movement resulted. Gideon peered down at the bottom, where shadows gathered over the cold white doors of Castle Dryerba, stately in the dirt set into the rock. 3 badas wide and 6 badas tall to braziers stood on either side of the door and perpetually burned fatty crappy smoke. Over the doors were tiny white figures in a multitude of poses, hundreds to thousands of them, carved using some weird trick where their eyes seemed to look right at you. Whenever Gideon had been made to go through those doors as a kid, she'd screamed like she was dying. More activity in the lowest tiers. Now the light had settled into visibility. The ninth would be coming out of their cells after morning contemplation, getting ready to head for Arisen, and the Dreber retainers would be preparing for the day ahead. They would perform many asylum and inane ritual in the lower recesses. Gideon tossed her empty porridge bag over the side of the tier and sat down with her sword over her knees, cleaning it with a bit of rag. 40 minutes to go. Suddenly, the unchanging tedium of a ninth morning changed. The first bell sounded again. Blah 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 blank. Gideon cocked her head to listen. Finding her hands had stilled on her sword, it rang fully 20 times before stopping. A muster call. After a while came the clatter of the skeletons again. Having obediently tossed down pick and hoe to meet their summons, they streamed down the tears in an angular current, broken up every so often by some limping figure in vestments of rusting black. Gideon picked up her sword and cloth again. It was a cute try, but she wasn't buying. She didn't look up when heavy stomping footsteps sounded on her tear, or for the rattle of rusting armor and the rusty rattle of breath. 30 whole minutes since I took it off, Crux, she said, hands busy. It's almost like you want me to leave here forever. Oh shit, you absolutely do, though. You ordered a shuttle through deception, bubbled the Marshal of Dreber, whose main claim to fame was that he was more decrepit alive than some of the legitimately dead. He stood before her on the landing field and gurgled with indignation. You falsified documents. You stole a key. You removed your cuff. You wrong this house. You misuse its goods. You steal its stock. Come on, Crocs. We can come to some arrangement. Gideon coaxed, flipping her sword over and looking at it critically. For nix, you hate me. I hate you. Just let me go without a fight. You can retire in peace. Take up a hobby. Write your memoirs. You wrong this house. You misuse its goods. You steal its stock. Crocs loved verbs. Say my shuttle exploded. I died, and it was such a shame. Give me a break, Cracks. I'm begging you here. I'll trade your skin. Mag front line. Titties of the 5th. This rendered the Marshal momentarily to August to respond. Okay, I take it back. Frontline Titties isn't a real publication. Crocs advanced like a glacier with an agenda. Gideon rolled backward off her seat as his antique fist came down, skidding out of his way with a shower of dust and gravel. Her sword she swiftly locked within its scabbard, and the scabbard she clutched in her arms. Like a child, she propelled herself backward out of the way of his boot in his huge horny hands. Crux might have been very nearly dead, but he was built like gristle with what seemed like 30 knuckles to each fist. He was old, but he was goddamn ghastly easy. Marshal, she said, though she was the one floundering in the dirt. Take this much further and you're in danger of enjoying yourself. You talk so loudly for chattel. Nav said the marshal, you chatter so much for a date, I hate you. And yet you are my wares and inventory. I have written up your lungs as lungs for the night. I have measured your goal as goal for the night. Your brain is a base and shriveled sponge, but a 2 is for the night. Come here, and I'll black your eyes for you and knock you dead. Gideon slid backward, keeping her distance. Crocs, she said, a threat's meant to be come here or come here, and I'll black your eyes for you and knock you dead. Cracks the advancing old man, and then the lady has said that you will come to her. Only then did Gideon's palms prickle. She looked up at the scarecrow towering before her, and he stared back, one-eyed, horrible, baleful. The antiquated armor seemed to be rotting right off his body, even though the livid, overstretched skin on his skull looked in danger of peeling right off. He gave the impression that he simply wouldn't care. Gideon suspected that even though he had not a whit of necromancy in him, the day he died, Crux would keep going anyway out of sheer malice. Black my eyes and knock me dead, she said slowly. But your lady can go right to hell. Crux spat on her. That was disgusting. But whatever, his hand went to the long knife kept over one shoulder in a mold-splattered sheath, which he twitched to show a thin slice of blade. But at that, Gideon was on her feet, with her scabbard held before her like a shield. One hand was on the grip, the other on the locket of the sheath. They both faced each other in impasse, her very still, the old man's breath loud and wet. Gideon said, don't make the mistake of drawing on me, Crux. You are no half as good with that sword as you think you are. Gideon, after the Marshal of Drebber, and one day I'll fly you for disrespect. One day we will use your parts for paper. One day the sisters of the Locktune will brush the os with your bristles. One day your obedient bones will dust all places you disdain, and make the stones there shine with your fat. There is a master Nav, and I command you now to go. Gideon lost her temper. You go, you dead old dog, and you damn well tell her I'm already gone. To her enormous surprise, he wheeled around and stumped back to the dark and slippery tier. He rattled and cursed all the way, and she told herself that she had won before she even woke up that morning. That Crux was an impotent symbol of control. One last attempt to test if she was stupid enough or cowed enough to walk back behind the cold bars of her prison. The gray and putrid heart of Drebber, the grayer, a more putrid heart of its lady. She pulled her watch out of her pocket and checked it. 20 minutes to go, a quarter hour and change. Gideon was home free. Gideon was gone. Nothing and nobody could change that. Now Crux is abusing you. To anyone who will listen, said a voice from the entryway. With 15 minutes to go, he said, you made your blade naked to him. He said you offered him sick pornographies. Gideon's palms prickled again. She sat back down on her awkward throne of rocks and balanced her watch between her knees, staring at the tiny mechanical hand that counted the minutes. I'm not that dumb like Lemonade, she said. Threaten a house official, and I wouldn't make toilet wiper in the cohort. And the pornography, I did offer him stupendous work of a titty nature, and he got offended, said Gideon. It was a very perfect moment. The cohort's not going to care about that though. Have I mentioned the cohort? You do know the cohort, right? The cohort I've left to enlist in 33 times. Save the drama, you baby, said her swordmaster. I know of your desires. Like Lemonade dragged herself into the small light of the landing field. The captain of the house guard had a head of melty scars and a missing leg, which an indifferently talented bone adept had replaced for her. It bowed horribly and gave her the appearance of a building with the foundations hastily shored up. She was younger than Crocs, which was to say old as bulls, but she had a quickness to her, a liveliness that was clean. The Marshal was classic ninth, and he was filthy rotten all the way through. 33 times, repeated Gideon somewhat wearily. She checked back on her clockwork. 14 minutes to go. The last time she jammed me in the lift. The time before that she turned off the heating, and I got frostbite in 3 toes. Time before that she poisoned my food and had me crapping blood for a month. Need I go on? Her teacher was unmoved. There was no disservice done. You didn't get her permission. I'm allowed to apply for the military, Captain. I'm indentured, not a slave. I'm no fiscal use to her here. Beside the point, you chose a bad day to fly the coop. I glam and jerked her head downward. There's house business, and you're wanted downstairs. This is her being sad and desperate, said Gideon. This is her obsession. This is her need for control. There's nothing she can do. I'll keep my nose clean, keep my mouth shut. You can write this down. You can quote me here. Do my duty to the 9th house, but don't pretend at me. I glammin' at the moment I go down there. A sack won't come down over my head, and I won't spend the next 5 weeks Concustin and os you egotistical fetus, you think Our Lady rang the mustical just for you, so here's the thing, your lady would set the locked tomb on fire if it meant I'd never see another sky. Gideon said, looking up, your lady would stone cold eat a baby. If it meant she got to lock me up infinitely, your lady would slather burning turds on the great ants. If she thought it would ruin my day, your lady is the nastiest bit. When I glamin slapped her, it had none of the trembling affrontedness crux might have slapped her with. She simply backhanded Gideon the way you might hit a barking animal. Gideon's head was starry with pain. You forget yourself, Gideon. Never. Teacher said shortly, you're no slave, but you'll serve the house of the ninth until the day you die, and then thereafter, and you'll commit no sin of perfecti in my ere the bell was real. Will you come to master of your own accord, or will you disgrace me? There was a time when she had done many things to avoid disgracing Igleminy. It was easy to be a disgrace in a vacuum, but she had a soft spot for the old soldier. Nobody had ever loved her in the house of the ninth, and certainly Igleminate did not love her, and would have loved herself to her overdue death at the idea. But in her had been a measure of tolerance, a willingness to loosen the leash and see what Gideon could do with free rein. Gideon loved free rein. Iglemin had convinced the house to put a sword in Gideon's hands, not to waste her on serving altar or dredging in the os. Iglemin wasn't faceless. Gideon looked down and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and saw the blood in her saliva and saw her sword, and she loved her sword so much she could friggin' marry it. But she also saw her clock's minute hand ticking down. 12 minutes to go. You didn't cut loose by getting soft for all its moldering brittleness. The ninth was hard as iron. I guess I'll disgrace you, Gideon admitted easily. I feel like I was born to it. Unnaturally demeaning. Her swordmaster held her gaze with her aged hawk's face and her pouchy socket of an eye, and it was grim. But Gideon didn't look away. It would have made it somewhat easier if Iglemin had made a crux out of it and cursed her lavishly. But all she said was such a quick study, and you still don't understand. That's on my head. I suppose the more you struggle against the ninth nerve, the deeper it takes you. The louder you curse it, the louder they'll have you scream back, straight as a poker. Like Lamina walked away with her funny seesawing walk, and Gideon felt as though she failed a test. It didn't matter, she told herself. To down, none to go. 11 minutes until landing. Her clockwork told her 11 minutes, and she was out. That was the only thing that mattered. That was the only thing that had mattered since a much younger Gideon had realized that unless she did something drastic, she was going to die here down in the dark. And worst of all, that would only be the beginning. Nav was a Niner name, but Gideon didn't know where she'd been born. The remote and censored planet where she lived was home to both the stronghold of the house and a tiny prison used only for those criminals whose crimes were too repugnant for their own houses to rehabilitate them on home turf. She'd never seen the place. The ninth house was an enormous hole cracked vertically into the planet's core. In the prison, a bubble installation set halfway up into the atmosphere where the living conditions were probably a hell of a lot more clement. One day 18 years ago, Gideon's mother had tumbled down the middle of the shaft in a drag chute, and a battered hazard suit like some moth drifting slowly down into the dark. The suit had been out of power for a couple of minutes. The woman landed brain dead. All the battery power had been sucked away by a biocontainer plugged into the suit, the kind you'd carry a transplant limb in, and inside that container was Gideon, only a day old. This was obviously mysterious as hell. Gideon had spent her life poring over the facts. The woman must have run out of juice an hour before landing. It was impossible that she would have cleared gravity from a drop above the planet. As her simple as would have exploded. The prison, which recorded every coming and going, obsessively denied her as an escapee. Some of the non-adepts of the locked tomb were sent for those who knew the secrets for Cajun ghosts. Even they, old in their power, then seasoned necromancers of the dark and powerful house of the ninth, couldn't rip the woman's shade back to explain herself. She would not be tempted back for fresh blood or old. She was too far gone by the time the exhausted nuns had tethered her by force, as though death had been a catalyst for the woman to hit the ground running, and they only got one word out of her. She had screamed, Gideon, 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 3 times and fled. If the ninth, enigmatic, uncanny ninth, the house of the stone tongue, the anchorites' house, the house of heretical secrets, was nonplussed at having an infant on their hands, they moved first anyway. The ninth had historically filled its halls with penitents from other houses, mystics and pilgrims, who found the cool of this dreary order more attractive than their own birthrights in the antiquated rules of those supplicants who moved between the 8 great households. She was taken as a very small bondwoman, not of the 9th, but beholden to it. What greater debt could be accrued than that of being brought up? What position more honorable than vassal to dribber let the baby grow up, postulant push the child? 2. Be an oblate. They chipped her surname her and put her in the nursery. At that time the tiny 9th house boosted to 100 children between infancy and 19 years of age, and Gideon was numbered to 101st. Less than 2 years later, Gideon Nerve would be one of only 3 children, left herself a much older boy and the infant heir of the 9th house, daughter of its lord and lady. They knew by age 5 that she was not a necromancer, and suspected by 8 that she would never be a nun. Certainly they would have known by 10 that she knew too much, and that she could never be allowed to go. Gideon's appeals to better natures, financial rewards, moral obligations outlined plans and simple attempts to run away numbered 86. By the time she was 18, she'd started when she was for chapter 2. There were 5 minutes to go when Gideon's 87th escape plan got messed up fantastically. I see that your genius strategy, Griddle, said a final voice from the tierway, was to order a shuttle and walk out the door. The lady of the 9th house stood before the drill shaft wearing black and sneering. Reverend daughter Harrowhawk Nanajimus had pretty much cornered the market on wearing black and sneering. It comprised 100% of her personality. Gideon marveled that someone could live in the universe only 17 years and yet wear black and snare with such ancient self-assurance. Gideon said, "Hey, what can I say? I'm a tactician." The ornate, slightly soiled robes of the house dragged in the dust as the Reverend daughter approached. She brought her marshal along, and I glaminate to a few sisters were behind her on the tier, having sunk down to their knees. The closer women painted their faces alabaster gray and drew black patterns on their cheeks and lips like death's heads, dressed in breadths of rusty black cloth. They looked like a peanut gallery of saddled waste-time masks. It's embarrassing that it had to come to this. So the lady of the 9th, pulling back her hood, her pale painted face was a white blotch among all the black. Even her hands were gloved. "I don't care that you run away, I care that you do it badly. Take your hand from your sword. You're humiliating yourself. In under 10 minutes a shuttle's going to come and take me to Trenton on the 2nd, Gideon said, and did not take her hand from her sword. "I'm going to get on it. I'm going to close the door. I'm going to wave goodbye. There is literally nothing you can do anymore to stop me." Harrow put one gloved hand before her and massaged her fingers thoughtfully. The light fell on her painted face and black daubed chin and her short-cropped, dead crow-colored hair. "All right, let's play this one through for interest's sake," she said. "First objection. The cohort won't enlist an unreleased serf. You know I faked your signature on the release form," said Gideon. "But a single word from me and you're brought back in cuffs. You'll say nothing." Harrow heart ringed the fingers around one wrist and slowly worked the hand up and down. "It's a cute story, but badly characterized," she said. "Why the sudden mercy on my part? The moment you deny me leave to go," said Gideon, hand unmoving on her scabbard. "The moment you call me back, the moment you give the cohort calls, or I don't know, some list of trumped-up criminal charges. Some of your magazines are very nasty," admitted the lady. "That's the moment I squeal," said Gideon. "I squeal so long and so loud they hear me from the 8th. I tell them everything, you know what I know, and I'll tell them the numbers that bring me home in cuffs. But I'd come back laughing my ass off." At that, Harrowhark stopped working her scaphoid and glanced at Gideon. She gave a rather bruised "can't" wave to the geriatric fan club behind her, and they scattered, torturing, kissing the floor and rattling both their prayer beads and their unlubricated knee joints, disappearing into the darkness and down the tear. "Only crux," and I glamin stayed. Then Harrow cocked her head to the side like a quizzical bird and smiled a tiny contemptuous smile. "How cool and ordinary," she said. "How effective, how crass. My parents should have smothered you. I'd like to see them try it now," said Gideon, unmoved. "You should do it even if there was no ultimate gain," the lady said. "And she even seems to be marveling at it, even though you know what you'd suffer, even though you know what it means. And all because," said Gideon, checking her clock again. "I completely fucking hate you, because you are a hideous witch from hell." "No offense." There was a pause. "Oh, Riddle," said Harrow pityingly in the silence, "but I don't even remember about you most of the time. They stared at each other. There was a lopsided smile, tugging at Gideon's mouth unsuppressed, and looking at it made Herahark's expression slide into something even moodier and more petulant. "You have me as an impasse," she said, as she sounded grudgingly amazed by the fact your ride will be here in 5 minutes. "I don't doubt you have all the documents, and that they look good. It should be master sin if I employed unwarranted violence. There's really nothing I can do." Gideon said nothing. Hero said, "We must call Israel. You know there's important ninth business afoot. Won't you give a handful of minutes to take part in your house's last master?" "Oh hell no, Sir Gideon. Can I appeal to your deep sense of duty?" "Nope, Sir Gideon, worth a try," admitted Hero. She tapped her chin thoughtfully. "What about a bribe?" "This is going to be good," said Gideon too. "Nobody in particular, Gideon. Here's some money. You can spend it right here on Bones." "Gideon, I'll always be nice and not a dick to you. If you come back, you can have Crux's room." "Gideon, here's a bed of writhing babes. It's the cloist rights though, so there." 90% osteoporosis from out of her pocket. With no small amount of drama, her heart drew a fresh piece of parchment. It was paper, real paper, with the official letterhead of the House of the Ninth on the top. She must have raided the coffers for that one. The hairs on the back of Gideon's neck prickled in warning. Hero ostentatiously walked forward to leave it at a safe middle point between them both and backed away with hands open. "And surrender, or," said the lady as Gideon slowly went to pick it up. "It could be an absolutely authentic purchase of your commission in the cohort. You can't forge this. Griddle is to be signed in blood, so don't stuff it down your trousers." Yet it was real ninth bond, written correctly and clearly. It purchased Gideon Nerve's commission to second lieutenant, not privy to resale, but relinquishing capital. If she honorably retired, it would grant her full officer training. The usual huge percentage of prizes and territory would be tied to her house if they were won, but her inflated ninth serfdom would be paid for in 5 years on good conditions rather than 30. It was more than generous. Hero was shooting herself in the foot. She was gamely firing into one foot and then taking aim at the other. She'd lose rights to Gideon forever. Gideon went absolutely cold. "You can't say I don't care," said Hero. "You don't care," said Gideon. "You'd have the nuns eat each other if you got bored. You are a psychopath." Hero said, "If you don't want it, return it. I can still use the paper." The only sensible option was to fold the bond into a dart and sail it back the way it came for minutes until the shuttle landed and she was able to make hot tracks far away from this place it already won. And this was a vulnerability that would put everything she'd worked for months of puzzling out how to infiltrate the shuttle standing order system, months to hide her tracks, to get the right forms, to intercept communications, to wait and sweat into jeopardy. It was a trick, and it was a Hero-Hark nonagesimus trick, which meant it was going to be atrociously nasty. Gideon said, "Okay, name your price. I want you downstairs." At the master meeting, she didn't bother to hide her amazement. "What are you announcing?" Hero, the reverend daughter, remained smileless. "Wouldn't you like to know?" There was a long moment. Gideon let a long breath escape through her teeth, and with a heroic effort she dropped the paper on the ground and backed away. Nashi said, "I was interested to see a tiny beetling of the lady's black eyebrows. I'll go my own way. I'm not going down into Dribba for you." "Hell, I'm not going down into Dribba if you get my mother's skeleton to come do a jig for me." Hero bunched her gloved hands into fists and lost her composure. "For God's sake, Griddle, this is the perfect offer. I am giving you everything you've ever asked for, everything you've whined for so in recently, without you even needing to have the grace or understanding to know why you couldn't have it. You threaten my house, you disrespect my retainers, you lie and cheat and sneak and steal. You know full well what you've done, and you know that you are a disgusting little cuckoo. I hate it when you act like a but touched none," said Gideon, who was only honestly sorry for one of the things in that lineup. "Fine snot." Hera-Hark, now in every appearance of a fine temper, she was struggling out of her long ornate robes, the human ribcage she wore clasped around her long torso shining whitely against the black Crocs, cried out in dismay as she began to detach the little silver snaps that held it to her chest. But she silenced him with a curt gesture. She took it off. Gideon knew what she was doing. A great wave of commingled pity and disgust moved through her as she watched Hero take off her bone bracelets, the teeth she kept at her neck, the little bone studs in her ears. All these she dumped in Crux's arms, stalking back to the shuttle field and presenting herself like an emptied quiver, just in gloves and boots and shirts and trousers, with her cropped black head in her face pinched with wrath. She seems like what she really was, a desperate girl, younger than Gideon and rather small and feeble look, known as Jesma, said Gideon, thoroughly unbalanced and now actually embarrassed. Cut the bull, don't do whatever you're about to do, let me go, you don't get to turn and leave quite so easily, Nav, said Harrow Hark with palpable chill. You want your ass kicked by way of goodbye? Shut up to the lady of the night, and horrifyingly I'll alter the terms of fair fight, and I live scot-free. I'm not that stupid. No, a fair fight, and you can go with the commission, said Hero. If I win, you come to the master and you leave afterward with the commission. If I lose, you leave now with the commission. She snatched the paper from the ground, pulled a fountain pen from her pocket and slid it between her lips to stab it deeply into her cheek. It came out thick with blood. One of her party tricks, Gideon thought normally, and signed Heliomana Novenarius, Reverend Mother of the Locked Tomb, Lady of Dreba, ruler of the 9th house. Gideon said, feeling idiotic. That's your mother's signature. I'm not going to sign as me, you utter moron. That would give the whole game away, said Harrow. This close, Gideon could see the red starbursts at the corners of her eyes, the pink smears of someone who hadn't slept all night. She held out the commission, and Gideon snatched it with shameless hunger, folding it up and shoving it down her shirt and into her bando. Hero didn't even smirk. Agree to duel me now in front of my marshal and guard a fair fight above all else. Harrow Hark was a skeleton maker, and in her rage and pride she was offering an unfair fight. Instead, the thoroughbred 9th adept had unmanned herself by starting a fight with nobody to raise and not even a bone button to help her. Gideon had seen Hero in this mood only once before and had thought she would probably never see her in this mood again. Only a complete asshole would agree to such a duel, and Hero Harp knew it. It would take a dyed-in-the-wall douchebag. It would be an embarrassing act of cruelty. If I lose, I go to your meeting and leave with the commission, said Gideon. Yes, if I win, I go with the commission now, said Gideon. Blood flicked Harrow's lips. Yes. Overhead, a roar of displaced air. A searchlight flickered over the drill shaft as the shuttle, finally making its descent, approached the wound in the planet's mantle. Gideon checked her clock to minutes. Without a moment's hesitation, she patted the reverend daughter down, arms, midsection, legs, a quick clutch around the boots. Crux cried out again in disgust and dismay at the sight. Harrow said nothing, which was more contemptuous than anything she could have said. But you didn't get anywhere through softness. The house was hard as iron. You smashed iron where it was weak. You all heard her, she said to Crux. To Iglaman. Crux stared back at her with the hate of an exploding star, the empty hate of pressure pulled inward, a deforming light, devouring resentment. Iglaminate refused to meet her gaze that sucked. But fine. Gideon started digging around in her pack for her gloves. You heard her. You witnessed. I'm going either way. And she offered the terms. Fair fight. You swear by your mother it's a fair fight. How dare you, Nav? By your mother. And to the floor. I swear by my mother I have nothing on me. To the floor, snapped her breath coming in staccato pants of anger as Gideon hastily slipped on her polymer mitts, flipping the thick clasp shut at the wrists. Her smile twisted. My God, Griddle, you're not even wearing leather. I'm hardly that good. They stepped away from each other. Iglaminate finally raised her voice over the growing noise of the shuttle. Gideon, Nav, take back your honor and give your lady a weapon. Gideon couldn't help herself. Are you asking me to throw her a bone? Now I gave her my whole life, said Gideon, and unsheathed her blade. The sword was really just a gesture. What ought to have happened was that Gideon raised a booted foot and knocked Harrow ass over tits hard enough to prevent the lady of the 9th embarrassing herself by getting up over and over and over a booted foot on Harrow's stomach, and it would have all been done. She would have sat on Harrow if she'd needed to. No one in the 9th house understood what cruelty was. Not really. None of them. But the reverend daughter, none of them understood brutality. The knowledge had been dried out of them, evaporated by the dark that pulled at the bottom of Dreba's endless catacombs. By Glamine or Crux would have had to call it a fair fight. One and Gideon would have walked away a nearly free woman. What happened was that Hero Hark peeled off her gloves. Her hands were wrecked. The fingers were riddled with dirt and oozing cuts and grits stuck in the wounds, and beneath the messed up nails she dropped the gloves and wiggled her fingers in Gideon's direction, and Gideon had a split second to realize that it was drill shaft grit. and that she was absolutely boned in all directions. She charged. It was too late next to the drifts of dirt and stone that she had carefully kicked apart. Skeletons burst out of the hard earth where they had been hastily interred. Hands erupted from little pockets in the ground, perfect for fingered and thumbed. Gideon, stupid with assumption, kicked them off and creamed sideways. She ran. It didn't matter. Every 5 feet, every 5 goddamned feet, bones burst from the ground, grasping her boots, her ankles, her trousers. She staggered away, desperate to find the limits of the field. There were none. The floor of the drill shaft was erupting, and fingers and wrists waving gently as they buffeted by the wind. Gideon looked at Hero. Hero was breaking out in blood sweat, and her return stare was calm and cold and assured. She plunged back toward the Lady of Dree, but with an incoherent yell, smashing carpals and metacorpals to bits as she ran. But it didn't matter. From as little as a buried femur, a hidden tibia, skeletons formed for Hero in perfect wholeness, and as Gideon neared their mistress, a tidal wave of reanimated bones crusted down on her. Her booted foot knocked Hero into the arms of 2 of her creations, who carted her easily out of harm's way. Hero Hark's unperturbed gaze disappeared behind a blur of fleshless men of femur and tibia and supernaturally quick grasp. Gideon used her sword like a leva, showering herself in chips of bone and cartilage and trying to make each card count. But there are too many of them. There were just so many. Replacements rose. Even as she pulverized them into rains of bone, more and more cannonballed her down to the ground. And no matter in what direction she lushed from the fruits of the morbid garden Hero had sowed, the roar of the shuttle drowned out the clattering of bones and the blood in her ears as she was grabbed by dozens of hands. Hero Hark's talent had always been in scale, in making a fully realized construct from as little as an arm bone or a pelvis, able to make an army of them from what anyone else would need for one. And in some far-off way, Gideon had always known that this would be how she went, gangbanged to death by skeletons. The melee melted away to admit a booted foot that knocked her down. The bone men held her to the earth as she reared up, spitting and bleeding, to find Hero tucked between her grinning minions. Pensive, serene, Hero Hark kicked Gideon in the face. For a couple of seconds everything was red and black and white. Gideon's head lulled to the side as she coughed out a tooth-choking thrashing to rise. The boot pressed itself to her throat, then down and down and down, forcing her back into the hard grit floor. The shuttle's descent whipped up a storm of stinging dust, sending some of the skeletons flying. Hero discarded them and they rattled into still anatomical piles. It's pathetic, Griddle said. The Lady of the Ninth Bones were shedding from her minions now, after the initial adrenaline rush, peeling off and falling inert to earth, an arm there, a jawbone. Here, as they wobbled out of shape, she'd pushed herself very hard. Radiating out from them was a circle of burst pockets in the hard ground like tiny exploded mines. She stood among her holes with a hot, bloody face and trickling nosebleed, and indifferently wiped her face with her forearm. It's pathetic, she repeated, slightly thick with blood. I turn up the volume, I put on a show. You feel bad, you make it so easy. I got more hot and bothered digging all night. You dug with Gideon, rather muffled with grit and dust all night. Of course this floor is hard as hell, and there's a lot to cover, you insane creep, said Gideon. Call it crux, ordered Hero Hark. It was with poorly hidden glee that her marshal called out, a fair fight, the foe is flawed, a win for the Lady Nona Gessimus. The Lady Nona Gessimus turned back to her, to retainers, and raised her arms up for her discarded robe to be slipped back around her shoulders. She coughed a small knot of blood up into the dirt and waved Crux off as he hovered about her. Gideon lifted her head, then let it fall back hard on the grid floor. Dazed and cold like laminate, was looking at her now with an expression she couldn't pass: sympathy, disappointment, guilt. The shuttle connected its docking feet to the ground, crunching hard into the floor. Gideon looked at it, its gleaming sides, its steaming engine vents, and tried to pull herself up on her elbows. She couldn't. She was too winded still. She couldn't even raise a shaking middle finger to the victor. She just kept looking at the shuttle and her suitcase and her sword back up. Griddle, Hero Hark was saying. She spat another clod out on the ground close to Gideon's head. Captain, go and tell the pilot to sit and wait. He'll get paid for his time. What have he asked after his passenger? My lady, God bless High Glamour, she's been delayed. Tell him he'll stand by on my grace for an hour with apologies. My parents have been waiting long enough, and this took somewhat longer than I thought. It would Marshall get her down to the sanctuary. Chapter 3. Gideon willed herself to pass out. His crux's cold, bony fingers closed around one of her ankles. It nearly worked. She woke up a few times to blink at the monotonous light that illuminated the lift down to the bottom of the main shaft and stayed awake when the marshal dragged her like a sack of rotten goods. Across the bottom of the tear she felt nothing, not pain, not anger, not disappointment, just a curious sense of wonder and disconnect. As she was hauled bodily through the doors of Dryber, she stirred to life for one last escape attempt. But when he saw her scribbling at the threadbare carpets on the slick dark floor, a crux kicked her in the head. Then she did pass out for a little while, for real, only waking up when she was heaped onto a forward pew. The pew was so cold her skin stuck to it, and each breath was like needles in the lungs. She came to freezing to the sound of the prayers. There was no spoken invocation in the 9th service. There was only the clatter of bones, knuckle bones, all threaded on woven cords, notched and worn, worked by nuns whose old fingers could prey on them so swiftly that the service became a murmurous rattle. It was a long, narrow hall, and she had been dumped right at the front of it. It was very dark. A rail of gas-discharged light ran all around the aisles, but it always lit like it didn't like the idea and glowed dismally. The arches overhead had been dusted with bioluminescent powders that sometimes trickled down as pale green glitter into the nave, and in all the radiating chapels sat speechless skeletons, still dusty from the farming. Squinting blearily over her shoulder, she saw that most of the sanctum was skeletons. It was a skeleton party. There was room in this deep, long channel of a church for 1,000, and it was half full of skeletons, and only very pockmarked with people. The people mostly sat in the transept, veiled nuns and solitaires, shaven heads sent cropped. The weary and scant inhabitants of the 9th house, mostly priests of the locked tomb now. They hadn't been soldiers or military friars. Since she was very young, the only member left of that order was Iglaman, who'd left her leg and any hope of getting the hell out of here. On some far-off front line, the clatter in the transept was occasionally interrupted by a wet-racking cough or the haggard clearing of somebody's throat. In the apse was a long bench, and there sat the last handful of the nobles of the house of the 9th, Reverend Daughter Harrow Hark, sitting modestly to the side, face dusted with a handful of luminescent powder that had stuck to the blood trails coming out of her nose. Her ghastly great-aunts and her parents, the lord and lady of the house, the Reverend Father and the Reverend Mother. The latitude had pride of place before the altar side onto the congregation crux, had the honor of sitting on a chair in one of the dank chavets amid a sea of candles, half of them already out. Next to him, at the only house cavalier Ordus, a wide and sad 9th youngster of 35, and next to Ortus sat his lady mother, an absolutely standard 9th crone who kept fussing at his ear with a handkerchief. Gideon blinked so that her vision would stop wobbling and focused on the ABS. They hadn't managed to cousin her inside Dreba for a good 2 years, and she hadn't seen the hideous great-aunts nor the lord and lady for a while. Blessed Sister Lacrimertar and Blessed Sister Isamertar were unaltered. They were still tiny, their faces still tight gray-painted dribbles. And as the 9th was free from miracles, they were still blind. They had black bands tied over their faces, with white staring eyes painted on the front. Each preferred to pray to sets of beads, one string in each shriveled hand. So they sat there clicking a four-part percussion with their suspiciously agile fingers. Otis hadn't changed either. He was still lumpy and sad. Being the primary cavalier to the house of the 9th had not fittiers been a title of any renowned. Cavaliers in other houses might be revered, and noble men and women of long genealogy or particular talent frequent heroes of Gideon's less prurient magazines, but in the 9th everyone knew you were chosen for how many bones you could hump around. Otis was basically a morbid donkey. His father, cavalier to Harrow's father, had been an enormous stony man of some gravity and devotion with a sword, and to huge panniers of fibulae. But Altus wasn't made in his mold. Coupling him to Hero had been rather like yoking a donut to a cobra. Iglaman had probably focused her frustrations on Gideon because Altus was such a drip. He was a sensitive, awful young man, and his mother was obsessed with him. Each time he caught a cold, he was swaddled and made to lie still until he got bed sores. Lord and lady she looked at, to though she honestly didn't want to, Lady Palamona and Lord Priam Hark sat Side by side, one gloved hand placed on a knee, the other joined to their partners as they prayed simultaneously on a string of ornate bones. Black cloths swayed them toe to neck, and their faces were mostly obscured by dark hoods Gideon could see their pale waxy profiles streaked with luminescent powder, the mark of Harrow's handprints still visible on both their eyes were closed. Perliamina's face was still frozen and fine, as it had been the last time Gideon had seen her, the dark wings of her brows unsilvered, the thin fretwork of lines next to each eye uncrowded by mu-primed jaw was still firm, his shoulder unstoped, his brow clear and unlined. They were utterly unchanged, less changed even than the shitty great ants. This was because they'd both been dead for years. Their mummified faces did not yield to time, because as Gideon knew, and the marshal, and the captain of the guard, and nobody else in the universe, Harrow Hark had frozen them forever. Ever the obsessive and secretive scholar, she had derived at great cost some forgotten way of preserving and puppeting the bodies. She had found a nasty forbidden's little book in the great 9th repositories of nasty forbidden's little books, and all the houses would have had a collective aneurysm if they knew she'd even read it. She hadn't executed it very well. Her parents were fine from the shoulders up, but from the shoulders down they were bad. Though she had admittedly been 10, Gideon had been 11 when the Lord and Lady of the House of the 9th had slipped into death in sudden awful secret. It was such a huge bag of ass how it had happened, what she'd found, what she'd seen. She hadn't been sad. If she'd been stuck being here as parents, she would have done the same years ago. Listen, said the Reverend Daughter of the 9th, rising to stand. The enthroned Lord and Lady should have taken charge of the sacred ritual, but they couldn't because they were mega dead. Harold Hark had handily gotten around this by giving them a vow of silence every year. She added to their penitence vows a fasting of daily contemplation of seclusion, so blandly and barefacedly that it seemed inevitable that someone would eventually say, "Hang on a minute, this sounds like a load of hot garbage," and she'd be found out. But she never was. Crux covered for her, and so did I. Glamour and the Lord's Cavalier had helpfully decided to die the day that Prime died, and so Gideon covered to hating every moment, saving up this last secret in the hopes that with it he could extort her freedom. All prayer beads stopped clacking. The hands of Hera's parents stilled unnaturally. In unison, Gideon slung her arms around the back of her pew and kicked one foot up atop the other, wishing her head would stop ringing. "The noble house of the 9th has called you here today," said Harrow Hark, "because we have been given a gift of enormous import. Our sacred emperor, the Necrolord Prime, the king of the 9 renewals, our resurrector, has sent us summons that got asses in seats." The skeletons remained perfectly still and attentive, but Aquarius excitement arose from the assorted 9th congregation. There were soft cries of joy, there were exclamations of praise and thankfulness. The letter could have been a drawing of a butt, and they would have been lining up thrice to kiss the edge of the paper. "I will share this letter with you," said Harrow Hark, "because nobody loves their people, their sacred brothers and sacred sisters, as the 9th house loves her people, her devotees, and her priests, her children, and her faithful." Gideon thought Hero was slathering it on pretty thick. If the Reverend Mother will permit her daughter to read, like she'd say no. With Harrow's hands on her strings, with a pallid smile, Perliamina gently inclined her head in a way she never had in life alive. She had been as chill and remote as ice at the bottom of a cave. "With my gracious mother's permission," said Harrow, and began to read, addressing the House of the 9th, its Reverend Lady Palamona Hight Novernarius, and its Reverend Lord Priam Hight Nonir Vienna, salutations to the House of the 9th, and blessings upon its tombs, its peaceful dead, and its manifold mysteries. His celestial kindness the first reborn begs this house to honor its love for the Creator, as said in the contract of tenderness made on the day of the resurrection, and humbly asks for the first fruits of your household. "My name is listed here," said Harrow Hark, simpering modestly, then with less enthusiasm, "and Odysseus for a need. Now are the Emperor's hands the most blessed and beloved of the King, undying, the faithful, and the everlasting. The Emperor calls now for postulants to the position of lichted heirs to the 8 stalwarts who have served these 10,000 years, as many of them now lie waiting for the rivers to rise on the day they wake to their king. Those lonely guard remaining petition for their numbers to be renewed, and their Lord above Lords to find 8 new legmen. To this end we beg the first of your house and their cavalier to kneel in glory and attend the finest study that of being the emperor's bones and joints his fists and gestures 8 we hope will meditate and descend. To the emperor in glory in the temple of the first house 8 new lectors joined with their cavaliers, and if the Necrolord highest blesses, but does not take they shall return home in full honor with trump and timbrel there is no dutiful gift. So perfect nor so lovely in his eyes Harrow Hark lowered the paper to a long silence, a real silence, without even the hint of a prayer knuckle clacking or a skeleton's jaw falling off. The 9th seemed completely taken aback. There was a wheezing squeal from one of the pews in the transept behind Gideon as one of the faithful decided to go the whole hog and have a heart attack, and this distracted everyone. Bonans tried their best, but a few minutes later it was confirmed that one of the hermits had died of shock and everyone around him celebrated his sacred good fortune. Gideon failed to hide a snicker as Harrowhax sighed, obviously calculating inside her head what this did to the current 9th census. I won't a second hand disturbed the community tomb as Audis's mother stood finger trembling, her other arm draped around her son's shoulders. He looked completely affrighted. She looked as though she were about to follow the faithful departed to an untimely grave, face frozen beneath her alabaster base paint, black skull paint slipping with sweat. My son, she cried out shrill and cracked. My firstborn, sweet his father's endowment, my only joy. Sister Glorica, please, said Harrow looking bored, or she's his mother, had wrapped both arms around him now and was weeping fully into his shoulder. Her own shook with very real fear and grief. He looked weightly depressed. She was saying between sobs, I gave you my husband, Lord, known as Theonis. I gave you my spouse, Lord, known as Theonis. Do you demand my son of me? Do you demand my son? Surely not now. You forget yourself. Glorica Croc snapped. I know the things that before cavaliers, my lord. I know his fate. Sister Glorica Harrow Heart said, be calm, he is young. Quaver Tortoise's mother half pulling him into the safety of the Chevy when she realized Lord Noners Lennis would not intercede. He is young, he is not robust, some would say otherwise, said Harrow Hark, sort of watche, but also said with his big somber eyes and his squashed disheartened voice, I do fear death, my lady. Harrow Hark, a cavalier should welcome death, said I. Glamin affronted. Your father welcomed death and flinching, said Crocs. At this tender piece of sympathy his mother burst into tears. The congregation muttered, mostly reproachful, and Gideon started to perk up. It wasn't quite the worst day of her life now. This was some great entertainment. Altus, not bothering to disentangle himself from his sobbing parent, was mumbling that he would make sure she was provided for. The heinous great aunts had returned to prayer and were crooning a wordless hymn. Crocs was loudly abusing Horse's mother, and Harrowhark stood in this sea mute and contemptuous as a monument. Leave and pray for gardens, or I'll take you off this sanctuary. Crocs were saying, I gave this house everything, I paid the highest price. What comes of Mortis marrying an immigrant? 8th, you shameful hag. Gideon was grinning so hugely that her split lips recommenced bleeding amid the massed heads of the uncaring dead, and the disturbed devout Harrowhack's eyes found hers, and that disdainful mask slipped in its blankness. Her lips thinned. The people clamored. Gideon winked. Enough, snapped the reverend daughter voice. Like a knife's edge, let us pray. Silence sank over the congregation, like the slowly falling flakes of luminescent dust. The sobbing of Ortis's mother hushed into silent, shuddering tears buried in her son's chest as he put his doughy arm around her. He was crying soundlessly into her hair. The hymn of the nasty great aunts ended on a high and tremulous note, never relieved, wasting away in midair. Hero bowed her head, and her parents did to simultaneous in obedience. The great aunts nodded their heads to their chests like lemonade, and Crocs followed suit. Gideon stared up at the ceiling and recrossed her ankles over each other, blinked bits of luminescent grit from her eyes. I pray the tomb is shut forever, recited Harrowhark with the curious vividity she always showed in prayer. I pray the rock is never rolled away. I pray that which was buried remains buried, insensate in perpetual rest with closed eye and stilled brain. I pray it lives, I pray it sleeps. I pray for the needs of the emperor, all giving the undying king his virtues and his men. I pray for the 2nd house, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, 7th, and 8th. I pray for the 9th house, and I pray for it to be fruitful. I pray for the soldiers and adepts far from home and all those parts of the empire that live in unrest and disquiet. Let it be So they all prayed to let it be so. With much rattling of bones, Gideon had not prayed for a very long time. She looked over the bald, gleaming skulls of the assembled skeletons and the short-haired heads of the faithful ninth, and wondered what she'd do first. When she left for Trentham, the sobs of Otis's unfortunate mother interrupted the clatter and her less than realistic thoughts of doing Chinyu PS in front of a dozen clapping enzymes, and she saw Harrow whispering to Crux, gesturing at mother and son, her face a painting of bloodless patience. Crux led them off the sanctuary, none too gently. They passed down the center of the nave, Crux hustling Otis, lumbering, Otis's mother barely able to stand in her misery. Gideon gave the unfortunate cavalier a thumbs up as they passed, or just returned a brief and watery smile. Muster broke up after that. Most of the congregation stayed to keep praying at their good fortune, knowing that the secondary spell would be ringing in a scant hour anyway. Gideon would have vaulted up to leave and sprint back to her shuttle first thing, but the skeletons flooded out in neat serried ranks down the center of the nave to abreast, blocking all other progress in their readiness to get back to their snow leaks and the heat lamps of their fields. The disgusting great ants removed themselves behind. The park closes to the claustrophobic family chapel off to one side, and Hera Hark ordered her parents' complacent mummies out of sight to wherever she usually hid them, back in their lavish household cell probably, and to bar the door after Gideon was massaging sprains from her fingers as her swordmaster came seesawing down the aisle. She lies, said Gideon absently, by way of greeting. If you hadn't noticed, she never keeps her promises. Not till one. I Glaminate did not answer. Gideon didn't expect her to. She just stood there, not yet meeting her student's gaze, one liver-spotted hand clutched tight to the grip of her sword. Eventually she said gruffly, "You have always suffered from a want of duty, Nev. You can't argue that you couldn't spell obligation if I shoved the letters up your ass. I gotta say, I don't think that would help," said Gideon. "God, I'm glad you didn't teach me my spelling. A soldier's best quality is her sense of allegiance, of loyalty. Nothing else survives, I know," said Gideon, and experimenting rose from the pew. She was standing fine, but her ribs ached. One was probably cracked her, but hurt from being dragged. She was going to be swollen with bruises before nightfall, and she needed to have a tooth put back in, not by one of the nuns, though never again. The cohorts would have bone magicians aplenty. "I know is fine, don't get me wrong, Captain. Where I'm going, I promise to piss fidelity all the live long day. I have lots of filthy in me." I felt the Emperor. With every bone in my body I felt hard. "You wouldn't know filthy if it don't hypothetically shove stuff up my butt again," said Gideon. "It never does any good." The lopsided old woman took a scabbard off her back and wearily handed it over. It was Gideon's. Her sword had been sheathed safely inside it. Like Laminate tossed her the abandoned suitcase to boot. This would be the closest to an apology she would get. The woman would never touch her, and she would never give her a word that had no edges, but this was nearly tender for the captain of the guard, and Gideon would take it and run. Determined footsteps sounded down the center aisle, alongside the sound of ancient lace rustling over slick obsidian. Gideon's gut tightened, but she said, "How the hell are you gonna get out of this one?" "Known Jazumas, I'm not," said Harrow, surprising her. The reverend daughter's sharp-angled foxy chin was thrust out, and she still had a thick rime of blood circling each nostril, but with her burning black eyes she looked exalted as a bad bone saint. "I'm going. This is my chance for intercession. You couldn't comprehend. I can't, but I also couldn't care less," said Gideon. "We all get our chances, Nev. You got yours." Gideon wanted to punch her lights out, but she said instead with forced jollity, "By the way, I worked out your nasty little trick, jackass." I Glaminate did not cuff her for this, which was also some sort of apology. She just jabbed a warning finger in her direction. Harrow cocked her chin up in genuine surprise, hood falling away from her dark short-cropped head. "Did you?" She drooled. "Really? Your mother's signature on the commission? The sting in the tail, if I come clean," she said, "that renders the signature null and void, doesn't it? It buys my silence." "Well played. I'll have to keep my mouth shut when I hand that one over, and you know it." Harold Hark cocked her head the other way lightly. "I hadn't even thought of that," she said. "I thought you meant the shuttle alarm bells rang." And Gideon's head, like the first and second peal, all mixed together. She could feel the heat drain from her face, and she was already backing out of the pew into the aisle, wheeling away. Harold Hawk's face was a painted study of innocence, of perfect Unconcerned at the expression on Gideon's eye, Glamour had put a hand on her sword, moving herself between the two with a warning stump of the leg. Gideon said with difficulty, "What about the shuttle o' autism? His mother stole it," said Harrow Hark. "They must be gone already. She still has family back on the 8th, and she thinks they'll take them." And at her expression, Harrow laughed. "You make it so easy, Griddle, you always do." Gideon had never confronted a broken heart before. She had never gotten far enough to have her heart broken. She knelt on the landing field, knees in the grid, arms clutched around herself. There was nothing left but blown-out curly patterns in the pebbles where the shuttle had passed. A great dullness had sunk over her, a deep coldness, a thick solidity when her heart beat in her chest. It was with a huge, steady grief. Every pulse seemed to be the space between insensibility and knives. For some moments she was awake, and she was filled with a slow burning mind fire, the kind that never went out and crumbled everything from the inside. For all the other moments, it was as though she had gone somewhere else. Behind her stood the lady of the 9th house, watching her with no satisfaction. "I got wind of your plan only last week," she admitted. Gideon said nothing. A week before, Harrow continued, "I wouldn't have known at all if I hadn't got the summons. You've done everything right. They said I could put my reply on the shuttle I had previously scheduled. If I wanted to write in paper, I will give you your due. There was no way you could have accounted for that. I could have spoiled it before. But I wanted to wait until now to do anything. I wanted to wait the very moment when you thought you'd gotten away to take it from you." Gideon could only manage why the girl's expression was the same as it was on the day that Gideon had found her parents dangling from the roof of their cell. It was blank and white and still. "Because I completely fucking hate you," said Harrow Hark. No offense. Chapter 4. It would have been neater perhaps if all of Gideon's disappointments and woes from birth downward had used that moment as a catalyst. If filled with a new and fiery determination, she had equipped herself down there in the dark with fresh ambition to become free. She didn't. She got the depression. She lay in herself, picking at life like it was a meal she didn't want to eat. She didn't touch her sword. She didn't go and jog around the planter fields and dream of what days looked like to cohort recruits. She stole a crate of the nutrient paste they put in the gruels and soups fed to the 9th faithful and squirted them in her mouth when she got hungry, listlessly leafing through magazines or lying back on her bed, crunching her body into sit. UPS to make time go away. Crux had snapped the security cuff back on her ankle, and she rattled it when she moved, often not bothering to turn on the lights, clinking around in the dark. A week's grace was all she got. The Reverend daughter turned up as she always goddamn did, standing outside the locked door of her cell. Goody, and knew she was there because the shadows in front of the little peephole changed, and because it would be nobody else by way of hello. She said fuck you and switched to push. UPS stop sulking, Griddle, go choke on a dick. I have work for you, said Harrowhack. Gideon let herself rest on the apex extension of her arms, staring down sightlessly at the cold floor. The sweat frosting on her back, her ribs still hurt when she breathed, and the cuff was heavy on her ankle, and one of the nuns had jammed her tooth back into hard, and it was like the woe of the emperor every time she sneezed. Nona Jessimus, she said slowly, the only job I'd do for you would be if you wanted someone to hold the sword as you fell on it. The only job I'd do for you would be if you wanted your ass kicked so hard the locked tomb opened and a parade came out to sing low a destructed ass. The only job I do would be if you wanted me to spot you while you back flipped off the top tier into Dribba. That's 3 jobs, said Harrow Hark. Die in a fire. Nona Jezumus. There was a rustle from outside, the light scrape of a pin being pulled from a stud before it was pushed through the mesh of the peephole. Belatedly, Gideon scrambled up to toss it back as one did a grenade, but the bead of Harrow's earring had landed in her cell, and from that tiny mote of bones sprung humorous radius, and Alna's skeletal hand gripped blindly at the key in the lock and turned it. Even as Gideon swung her boot around to smash it into splintery bits, it crumbled away to dust, including the stud. Harrow Hark. Nona Jesimus swung open the door, haloed faintly in the electric lights from the tier, her acerbic little face as welcome as a knee to the groin. If you want to do something interesting, come with me, she commanded. If you want to wallow in your shockingly vast reserves of self-pity, cut your throat and save me the food bill. Oh damn, then can I join your old man and lady in the puppet show? How the world would suffer Without your wit, said Harrow Hark blandly. Get your robe, we're going down to the catacomb. It was almost gratifying, Gideon reflected, struggling with the black folds of her church gown, that the heir to the house of the night refused to walk with her on the inside of the tier. She walked close to the wall, instead keeping pace half a step behind Gideon, watching for Gideon's hands and Gideon's sword. Almost gratifying, but not quite. Hero could make even overweening caution offensive. After long days, with just her little reading lamp, Gideon's eyes stung from the lukewarm light of the 9th drill shaft. She blinked myopically as the lift rattled them down to the doors of Dreeper. We're not going into the inner sanctuary, you recreant, Harrow said. As Gideon bought, we're going to the monument. Come the lifts that went down into the fetid bowels of Dribba. We're death traps. The ones they entered now down to the crypt were especially bad. This one was an open platform of oxygen-addled creaking metal tucked behind an iron door that Harrow opened with a tiny chip key from around her neck as they descended. The air that rushed up to meet them was so cold that it made Gideon's eyes water. She pulled the hood of her cloak down over her head and shoved her hands up its sleeves. The central buried mechanism that made their pit on this planet possible sang its low whining song, filling the elevator shaft, dying away as they went deeper and deeper into the rock. It was profoundly dark. Stark, strong lights swamped their landing, and they walked out into the labyrinth of cages filled with wiring. Generators that nobody knew how to work. The machines sat alone in their carved-out chilly niches, garlanded with black crepe from 9th devotees long dead, their barred housings keeping the two at arm's length. As they passed, the cave narrowed into a passageway, and the passageway terminated in a pitted door. Harrow pushed this open and led the way into a long oblong chamber of bone-choked niches and bad copies of funerary masks, of wrapped bundles and seriously ancient grave goods at one niche. Iglaman kneeled, having set herself the task of ransacking as many of the wrapped bundles as she could. Instead of a 9th robe, she wore a thick wool jacket and gloves, which gave her the appearance of a marshmallow pierced with for toothpicks of differing length. She was wearing a particularly pooh-faced, battle-weary expression as she picked through around 100 swords in varying stages of death. Next to her was a basket of daggers and a handful of knuckle knives. Some were rusted to hell, some were halfway rusted to hell. She was examining a sword and gloomily rubbing at a bit of built-up plaque on the blade. This plan is doomed, she said to them, without looking up. Success, Captain, said Harrow Hark. They're all archaeology, my lady. Unfortunate. What was all she's preferring these days? Speaking freely, said Iglaman. Waters preferred his mother in a book of sad poems. His father trained him to fight sword and buckler, but after his death she gave a somewhat creaking shrug. He was a damned poor swordsman at his peak. He was not his father's son. I would have trained him sword and powder, but he said he had the Qatar. But his sword must be good, surely. God knows, said Iglaman. It was heavy oil amalgam, and it had a rubber tip lighter than Nav's head. Harsh, said Gideon. No, lady, I'm looking for a blade in the style of his great-grandmother's, and a knife or a knuckle harder, said Harrow Hart decidedly. Or chain and knife, I think, my lady. Her captain said again, with more gentle deference than Gideon had known. The old woman possessed knife or knuckle. The knife will be impossibly difficult to adjust to. As it is you fight in a crowd, a chain-enclosed melee will be more of a danger to you than it will to anyone else. Gideon had long since decided that this was not a good place to be, and that the plans being hatched here were not plans she liked. She started to edge backward toward the door, picking her path as lightly as possible. Suddenly, there was her squeezing herself between the pillars and draping her arms above her head. Long folds of black robe shook down from her arms, making her look like a road-blocking bat. Oh, Nav, no, she said calmly. Not when you owe me. Oh, you, why, of course, said Harrow Hark. It was your shuttle. My cavalier ran off, and Gideon's fist jacked out toward Harrow's pointy nose. Less by design than accident, the other girls stumbled out of the way, half tripping, dusting herself off and narrowing her eyes as she circled around the pillar. If you're going to start that again, she said. Here she reached down and hauled up one of the discarded blades. It was at least mildly hilarious to see Hero have to heave with all the might of her like 3 muscles. Gideon took it while the necromancer rubbed fretfully at her wrists. Try that, she said. Gideon unsheathed and examined the sword. Long black pieces of crooked metal formed a decaying basket hilt. A terrifically worn black pummel seal depicted the tomb wrapped in chains. The Sign of the ninth, the blade itself was notched and cracked. Only way this kills someone is with lockjaw, she said. How are you gonna get all this back anyway? Did her look momentarily troubled? We're not my Glaminays too old for this. And that is why you, Griddle said. The lady ought to act as cavalier primary of the house of the night. You will accompany me to the first house as I study to become a lecturer. You'll be my personal garden companion, dutiful and loyal, and uphold the sacred name of this house and its people. Once Gideon had stopped laughing, leaning against the icy pillar and beating on it with her fist. She had to breathe long and hard in order to not crack up again. The beleaguered grimace on Iglaminay's hard-carved face had deepened into an outright sense of siege. She managed scrubbing away tears of mirth. Damn, give me a moment, okay? Like hell I will. Nonjazuma's herald ducked out from behind her pillar, and she walked toward Gideon, hands still clasped together. Her face held the beatific fire-white expression she'd had the day she told Gideon she was going off-planet, an unwavering resolve. Almost like joy, she stopped in front of the other girl and looked up at her, shaking the hood from her dark head. And she closed her eyes into slits. Come on, Nav, she said, and her voice was alight. This is your chance. This is your opportunity to come into glory. Follow me through this, and you can go anywhere. House Cavaliers can get any cohort position they like. Do this for me, and I won't just set you free, I'll set you free with a fortune, with a commission, with anything you want. This nettled her. You don't own me, oh Griddle, but I do, said Harrow. Hark, you're bound to the locked tomb, and at the end of the night, the locked tomb is me. The nominated hands are to enter the first house, Nav. Their names will be written in history as the new Imperial Saints. Nothing like this has ever happened before, and it may never happen again. Nav, I'm going to be a licker. Hello, I'm the woman who helped herald Hark Nana Jazumas's fascist rise to power, said Gideon to nobody in particular. Yes, the universe sucks. Now I knew this going in. Also, she betrayed me afterward, and now my body has been shot into the sun. Hero came too close, and Gideon did what she had never done in the past. She raised the rusted sword so that its naked point was level with the other girl's forehead. The necromancer adept did not flinch, just made her black smeared mouth a mocking moo of shock. I will never trust you. Your promises mean nothing. You've got nothing to give me. I know what you do. Given half a chance. Harrow's dark eyes were on Gideon's, past the blade pointed at her skull. Well, I have hurt your heart, she said. Gideon kept it absolutely level. I boohooed for hours. It won't be the last time and make you weep. My Glaminay's voice rattled out. Put that damn thing down. I can't bear to see you hold it with that grip and shocking. Gideon, consider this offer. Nav. Gideon pied around Harrow's shoulder, letting the blade drop, trashing the miserable thing scabbardless in the nearest niche. Captain, please don't be a proponent of this horseshit idea. It's the best idea we have. Nav said her teacher, Our Lady, is going off planet. That's the long and short of it. You can stay here in the house you hate, or go attain your liberty in service to the house you hate. This is your one chance to leave and to gain your freedom cleanly. Harrow Hart opened her mouth to say something, but surprising Goody and further Iglaminays silenced her with a gesture. The crappy swords were set aside with care, and the old woman pulled her bockety leg out from underneath her and leant the good one against the catacomb wall, pushing hard to stand with a clank of mail and bone disease. You can nothing for the ninth. That's fine. This is your chance to prove yourself. I'm not helping Nona Yazimas become a licker. She make me into boots. I have condemned your escapes, said Iglaminay. They were graceless and feeble, but she turned to the other girl with all due respect. You've dealt her to my lady. I hate this idea. If I were 10 years younger, I would beg you to condescend to take me, but you won't vouchsafe her, and so I must, you said. Harrow, there was a curious softness in her voice. Her black gaze was searching for something in the captain of her guard, and she did not seem to be finding it. I must, said Iglaminay. You'll be leaving me and Crux in charge of the house. If I vouchsafe the freedom of Gideon, Nav, and it is not given to her, then begging pardon for my ingratitude. It is a betrayal of myself, who is your retainer, and was your mother's retainer. Harrow Hart said nothing. She wore a thin, pensive expression. Gideon wasn't fooled. This look usually betokened Harrow's brain percolating outrageous nastiness. But Gideon couldn't think straight. A horrible dark red heat was traveling up her neck, and she knew it would go right to her cheeks if she let it. So she pulled the hood up over her head and said not a word and couldn't look at her swordmaster at all. "If she satisfies you, you must let her go," said I Glaminate firmly, "of course, with all the gracious promises of the knight. If she pulls this off, she can have whatever she likes," said Harold. "Hark, Isley, way too Isley. She have glory squirting out each orifice. She can do or be anything she pleases, preferably over on the other side of the galaxy, from where I am. Then I thank you for your mercy and your grace, and regard the matter settled," said I Anyhow, is it settled? I have patently not agreed to this shit." Both of them ignored Gideon. "Getting back to the original problem," said the old woman, settling painfully back down among the swords and the knives. "Nav has had none of Otis's training, not in manners nor in general scholarship, and she was trained in the sort of heavy infantry. Ignore the first. Her mental inadequacies can be compensated for the seconds. What I'm interested in, how difficult is it for a normal swordswoman to switch from a double-handed blade to a cavalier rapier? For a normal swordswoman to reach the standard of a house cavalier primary, you'd need years. For Nav, 3 months here." Gideon died briefly of gratification. She revived only due to the rising horror consequence of everything else, and she'd be up to the standard of the meanest, most behindhand cavalier alive. "Oh, nonsense," said Harrow languorously. "She's a genius with the proper motivation. Griddle could wield 2 swords in each hand and one in her mouth. While we were developing common sense, she studied the blade. Am I right, Griddle?" "I haven't agreed to Stone Cold Dick," said Gideon, "and I don't care how badass cavaliers are meant to be. I hate rapiers. All that bouncing around makes me feel tired. Now a two-hander, that's a swordsman's sword." "I don't disagree," said her teacher, "but a house cavalier with all her proper training is a handsomely dangerous thing. I saw the primary cavalier of the House of the Second fight in his youth, and my God, I never forgot it." Harrow was pacing in tiny circles now, but she could get to the point where she might believably possibly be mistaken for a trained cavalier of the House of the Ninth. "The reputation of the Ninth Cavalier Primary has not been what it was since the days of Mash's Nonir," said High Glamin, "and that was 1,000 years ago. Expectations are very low. Even then we'd be bloody lucky." Gideon pushed herself up from the pillar and cracked her knuckles, stretching her chill stiff muscles out before her. She rolled her neck, testing her shoulders, and unwrapped her robe from around herself. "I live for those days when everyone stands around talking about how bad I am at what I do. But it also gives me hurt feelings," she said, and took the sword she had abandoned for trash. She tested its weight in her hand, feeling what was to her an absurd lightness, and struck what she thought was a sensible stance. "How's this, Captain?" Her teacher made a noise in her throat somewhere between disgust and desolation. What are you doing with your other hand?" Gideon compensated. "No, oh Lord, put that down until I formally show you how. The sword and the powder," said Hero Hog eagerly. "The sword and the knuckle, my lady," said I'd Laminate. "I'm dropping my expectations substantially," Gideon said. "I still have absolutely not agreed to any of this." The reference daughter picked her way toward her over discarded swords and stopped once she was level with the pillar that Gideon had reflexively flattened her back against. They regarded each other for long moments, until the absolute chill of the monument made Gideon's teeth involuntarily chatter, and then Harrow's mouth twisted fleetingly indulgently. "I would have thought you would be happy that I needed you," she admitted, "that I showed you my girlish and vulnerable heart." "Your heart is a party for 5,000 nails," said Gideon. "That's not a no help. I Glaminate finds you a sword." Griddle, I leave the door unlocked. With that language and imperious command she left, leaving Gideon lolling her head back against the frigid stone of the pillar and chewing the inside of her cheek. It was almost worse getting left alone with the swordmaster. An awkward, chilly silence spread between them as the old woman grumpily picked through the pile, holding each rapier up to the light, pulling rancid strips of leather away from the grip. "It's a bad idea, but it's a chance. You know, should I Glaminate abruptly take it or leave it? I thought you said it was the best idea. We have it as for Lady Harrowhark. You're the best swordsman that the Ninth House has produced. Maybe ever. Can't say I never saw Noners fight. Yeah, you would have only been what, just born," said Gideon, whose heart was hurting keenly. "Shut your mouth or I'll shut it for you." Swords rattled into a leather case as I Glaminate selected a couple at hand, shaking a few of the knuckle knives into boot. The case creaked, and she creaked as she had to tip herself forward, painful with dignity, getting on her one-half good knee in order to pull herself up to stand. Gideon moved forward automatically, but one look from the woman's working eye was enough to make her pretend she'd just been getting back into her robes. Iglamine hauled the case over her shoulder, kicking unwanted swords back into a niche, yanking the useless sword from Gideon's nerveless hand. She paused as her fingers closed over the hilt. Her haggard face caught up in her consideration, a titanic battle apparently going on somewhere deep inside her head. One side gained the upper hand, and she said gruffly, "Nav, a word of warning," but there was something urgent in her voice, something worried, something new. "Things are changing. I used to think we were waiting for something, and now I think we're just waiting to die." Gideon's heart sagged. "You really want me to say yes, go on, and say no," said her captain. "It's your choice. If she doesn't take you, I'll go with her, and gladly. But she knows, and I know, and I think you damn well know that if you don't get out now, you won't even get out in a box. So what happens if I agree, breaking the spell?" Iglamine roughly shouldered the leather case into Gideon's arms, slapping it there, before stalking back the way that Harrow had left them. "Then you hurry up, if I'm to turn you into the 9th Cavalier I needed to start 6 years ago." Chapter 5. The second letter that they received. Care of the resurrecting king, the gentle emperor, was somewhat less prolix than the first. They were lurking in the personal Nona Gessimus library, a stone art room packed tight with shelves of the musty and neglected books Harrow Hark didn't study, and the musty, less neglected books that she did. Gideon sat at a broad, sagging desk piled high with pages covered in necromantic marginalia, most of them in Harrow's cramped and patient writing. She held the letter before her with one hand, with the other she wearily painted her face with a piece of fiber wadding and a pot of alabaster paint. Feeling absurdly young, the paint smelled acid and cold, and working the damn stuff into the creases next to her nose meant sucking globs of paint up her nostrils all day. Harrow was sprawled on a sofa spread with tattered brocade robes, abandoned scrawny black-clad legs crossed at the ankles. In Gideon's mind, she looks like an evil stick. Gideon reread the letter, then again twice before checking her face in a little cracked mirror. "Gorgeous, hot. I know you said first house like 3 times," she said, "but I thought you were being metaphorical. I thought it would fill you with a sense of adventure." "It damn well doesn't," said Gideon, rewording the wording. "You're taking me to the planet where nobody lives. I thought we'd end up on the 3rd or the 5th, or a sweet space station or something, not just another cave filled with old religious nut jobs. Why would there be a necromantic gathering on a space station?" This was a good point. If there was one thing Gideon knew about necromancers, it was that they needed power, energy. Death juice was abundant wherever things had died or were dying. Deep space was a necro's nightmare, because nothing had ever been alive out there, so there were no big puddles of death lying around for Harrow and her ilk to suck up with a straw. The brave men and women of the cohort looked on this limitation with compassionate amusement. "Never send an adept to do a soldier's job." Behold the last paragraph. Hero sat from the sofa, turning your Benedict eyes to lines 5 and 6. Unwillingly, Gideon turned her Benedict eyes to lines 5 and 6. "Tell me the implications." Gideon stopped painting and leant back in her chair before thinking better of it, easing it back down to the chilled tiles of the floor. There was something a little soggy about one of the legs. "No retainers, no attendants, no domestics." "Well, you'd be shitted all to hell otherwise. You'd have to bring along Crocs." "Look, are you really saying that nobody's going to be there but asking some crumbly old hierophants?" "That," said the reverend daughter, "is the implication, for crying out loud." "Then let me dress how I want and give me back my long sword." 10,000 years of tradition. Griddle. "I don't have 10,000 years of tradition, bitch," said Gideon. "I have 10 years of two-handed training and a minor allergy to face paint. I'm worth so much less to you with pizza face and a toothpick." The reverend daughter's fingers locked together, thumbs rotating in language circles. She did not disagree. 10,000 years of tradition, she said slowly, dictates that the 9th house should have been at its leisure to produce, at the very least, a cavalier with the correct sword, the correct training, and the correct attitude. Any implication that the 9th house did not have the leisure to meet even that expectation is as good as giving up. I'd be better off by myself than taking you, but I know how to fake this. I can provide the sword, I can provide a smashing of training, I cannot even slightly provide your attitude. 2 out of 3 is still not 3. The con depends on your shut mouth and your adoption of the minimal requirements. Griddle. So nobody realize is that we're broke and nearly extinct. and that your parents top themselves so nobody takes advantage of the fact that we lack conventional resources, said Hero, shooting Gideon a look that skipped warning and went straight to barrage. So nobody realize is that the house is under threat, so nobody realize is that my parents are no longer able to take care of its interests. Gideon folded the paper in half again and made it into corners. She rubbed it between her fingers for the rare joy of feeling paper crinkle, and then she dropped it on the desk and cleaned paint off her fingernails. She did not need to say or do anything except let the quiet roll out between them. We are not becoming an appendix of the third or fifth houses, continued the necromancer opposite. Do you hear me, Griddle? If you do anything that suggests we're out of order, if I even think you're about to hear. Hero shrugged quite calmly. I'll kill you naturally. You can't keep this a secret forever. When I am a licker, everything will be different, said Hero Hark. I'll be in a position to fix things without fear of reprisal, as it is our leverage now, is that nobody knows anything about anything. I've had 3 separate communicators already from other houses asking if I'm coming, and they don't even know my name. What the hell are you going to tell them? Nothing, idiot, said Hare. This is the house of the 9th Griddle. We act accordingly. Gideon checked her face and put down the paint and the wording. Act accordingly meant that any attempt to talk to an outsider as a kid had led to her getting dragged away bodily. Act accordingly meant the house had been closed to pilgrims for 5 years. Act accordingly had been her secret dread that 10 years from now everyone else would be skeletons, and explorers would find Altus reading poetry next to her and Harrow's bot as their fingers still clasped around each other's throats. Act accordingly to Gideon meant being secret and abstruse and super obsessed with tones. I won't have people asking questions. You look the part, give me that, commanded Hero, and she took the fat stick of black jar from Gideon's hand. She tried to turn Gideon's face up to hers by force, fingers grasping beneath the chin, but Gideon promptly bit her. There was a simple joy in watching Harrow swear furiously and shake her hand and peel off the bitten glove, like in seeing sunlight or eating a good meal. Hero began fiddling ominously with one of the bone pins at her ear, so, with extreme reluctance, as of an animal not wanting to take medicine, Gideon tilted her face up to get painted. Harrow took the black and stroked it beneath Gideon's eyes, numbed it gently, making her anticipate an exciting jab in the cornea. I don't want to dress up like a goddamn nun again. I got enough of that when I was 10, said Gideon. Everyone else will be dressing exactly how they ought to dress, said Hera. And if the 9th house contravenes that, the house least likely to do any such thing, then people will examine us a hell of a lot more closely than they ought. If you look just right, then perhaps they won't ask you any tricky questions. They may not discover that the cavalier of the house of the 9th is an illiterate peon. Hold your mouth closed. Gideon held her mouth closed, and once Harrow was done, said, I object to illiterate pin-up rags. Aren't literature. Nav, I read them for the articles when, as a young and disinclined member of the locked tomb, Gideon had painted her face. She had gone for the bare minimum of death. Said that the role demanded dark around the eyes, a bit around the nose, a slack black slash across the lips. Now as Harrow Hark gave her a little palm of cracked mirror, she saw that she was painted like the ancient tottering necromancers of the house, those ghastly and unsettling sages who never seemed to die, just disappear into the long galleries of books and coffins beneath Dreber. She'd been slapped up to look like a grim-toothed black socketed skull with big black holes on each side of the mandible. Gideon said drivily, I look like a douche. I want you to appear before me every day like this until the day we leave, said Harrow Hark, and she leant against the desk to view her handiwork. I won't cut you bald, even though your hair is ridiculous, because I know you won't shave your head daily. Learn this, paint with a robe. I'm waiting for the end, said Gideon. You know the payoff. If you let me have my head, I'd wear my breastplate and use my sword. You're an imbecile if you think I'll be able to fight properly wearing a robe. And I could cavalier until the rest of them went home. I could cavalier until they just made you a hand on the first day and put sexy pictures of me on a calendar. Where's the Enona Gessimus? There is no. And Harris said, and pushed herself away from Gideon's chair to throw herself back down on the sofa once more. If it were merely about getting what I wanted, I wouldn't have bothered to take you at all. I would have you packed up in 9 boxes and sent each box to a different house, the 9th box kept for Crux to comfort him in his old age. I will succeed with you in tow. and nobody will ever know that there was all. To miss with the house of the ninth, paint your face trained with the rapier you're dismissed. Isn't this the part where you give me intel? Gideon said, standing up and flexing her stiff muscles. Tell me all you know of the tasks ahead. Who we're with. What to expect? God knows, said Harrow. All you need to know is that you'll do what I say, or I'll mix bone meal in with your breakfast and punch my way through your gut, which was Skidding had to admit entirely plausible. Chapter 6. If Gideon had worried that the next 3 months would see her in close proximity to the Reverend daughter, she was dead wrong. She spent 6 hours a day learning where to put her feet when she wielded a one-handed sword, where to rest what seemed to her to be her useless, unused arm, how to suddenly make herself a sideways target and always move on the same stupid foot. At the end of each punishing session, Iglaminate would take her in a one-on-one fight and disarm her in 3 moves. Parry, damn you, parry was the daily refrain. This isn't your long sword, Nev. You block with it again, and I'll make you eat it. On the few early days when she had forgone the paint, Crux had appeared and turned off the heating to her cell, she would end up slumped on her tears, screaming with cold, numb, and nearly dead. So she wore the goddamn paint. It was nearly worse than her pre-Cavalier life, except that as a small mercy she could train instead of going to prayers, and as a bigger mercy, Crux and Harrow were nearly never around. The heir to the house had ordered her marshal to do something secret down in the bowels of Dribba, where bowed and creaking ninth brothers and sisters worked hour after hour at whatever grisly task Harold Hark had set. As for the lady of the ninth herself, she locked herself in the library and didn't come out very occasionally. She would watch Gideon train, remark on the absolute lack of progress, make Gideon strip her paint off her face, and command her to do it again. One day she and Iglaminate made Gideon walk behind Hero up and down the stairs, shadowing her until Gideon was nearly mad with impatience. The only dubious advantage to this was that she would sometimes hear snatches of conversation, standing motionless and rigid-backed with her hand on the pommel of her sword and her sight lying somewhere beyond Harrow's shoulder. Gideon was hungry for intel, but these exchanges were never very illuminating. The most she got was the day Hero too fretful to modulate her voice said outright naturally, "It's a competition, Captain. Even if the wording well, the third house will naturally be the best equipped, and the second will have spent half their lives at the front and be covered in cohort decorations. It doesn't signify. I don't care about soldiers or politicians or priests. It's a grayer house I worry about." Like Laminate said something that Gideon did not catch. Harrow gave a short, hard laugh. "Anyone can learn to fight. Hardly anyone learns to think." Otherwise, Hera stayed with her books and studied her necromancy, getting leaner and more haggard, crueler and more mean each night. Gideon fell into bed and was asleep before she could tend her blistered feet and massage her bruised body. On days when she had behaved very well, like Laminate let her train with her long sword instead, which had to pass for fun the last week before they were due to leave, came all at once, like startling awake from a half-remembered and unsettling dream. The Marshal of Dribba reappeared like a chronic disease to stand over Gideon as she loaded her trunk, all of it with old hand-me-downs of Odysseus that could be hastily remade into 3 different Gideon-sized articles. These reclaimed robes were like her normal clothes, Dawa and black, but better made Dawa and blacker. She spent a significant amount of time boring slats into the bottom of the trunk so that she could squirrel away her beloved deserted longsword, packing it like precious contraband. Like Lemonade had found and reforged the sword of Ordis's grandmother's mother and presented it to a nonplussed Gideon. The blade was black metal, and it had a plain black garden hilt, unlike the intricate messes of teeth and wires that adorned some of the other rapiers down at the monument. "Oh, this is boring." Gideon had certain disappointment. "I wanted one with a skull puking, another smaller skull, another skulls flying all around." But tasteful, you know, she was also given knuckles. They were even less ornate, being obsidian and steel set in thick and heavy bands. There were 3 black blades on the back of the gauntlet, originally fixed in place. "But for God's sake, don't use them for anything but a parry," said her teacher. "This is confusing. You made me train empty-handed." Gideon said her teacher, "After 11 ghoulish weeks of training, you beating you senseless and watching you fool around like a drop-cycle infant, you are on a miraculous day up to the standard of a bad Cavalier, one who's terrible." This was great praise, but you fall apart as soon as you start to overthink your offhand. Use the knuckles to balance, give yourself options. If someone gets inside your guard, though better yet, don't let them get inside your guard. Keep moving, be fluid. Remember that your hands are now sisters, not twins. One executes your primary action and the other supports the move. Pray they don't watch you fight too closely, and stop blocking every blow. On the final day, the entire house of the ninth filled the tear of the landing field, and they left room to spare. It was sad to watch their eagerness, their kissing. Harrow hacks them over and over. They all melt in prayer with the godful great answers. Their reverend daughter stood and watched tranquil and bloodless as the skeletons plowing in the tears above. Gideon had noticed the absence of the ex-reverend father and mother, but hadn't thought anything of it. She was too busy thinking about her itchy second hand clothes and the rapier buckled at her side and the paint that was now a second skin on her face. But she was still surprised when Harrow said, "Brothers and sisters, listen. My mother and father will not be with you. My father has sealed shut the passageway to the tomb that must always be locked, and they have decided to continue their penitence behind that wall until I return. The marshal will act as seneschal for me, and my captain will act as martial testament to Harrow's timing for drama." The second Darius bell began ringing from above the drill shaft. The shuttle started to make its descent, blotting out the ever fainter light of the equinox. For the very first time, Gideon did not feel the overwhelming sense of dread and suspicion. A pinprick of anticipation curled in her gut. Instead, round to go. Harrow Hark looked out at the people of the ninth. So did Gideon. There were all the assorted nuns and brethren, old pilgrims and aging vassals, every gloomy, severe, and stern face of adept and mystic, of joyless and wasted men and women, of the gray and monotonous population that had made up Gideon's life and never shown her one single moment of sympathy or kindness. Harrow's face was bright with elation, and further, Gideon would have sworn there were tears in her eyes, except that no such liquid existed. Harrow was a desiccated mummy of hate. "You are my beloved house," she said. "Rest assured that wherever I go, my heart is interred here." It sounded like she really meant it. Arrow began, "We pray the tomb is shut forever," and Gideon found herself reciting simply, because it was the only prayer she'd ever known, enduring the words by saying them as sounds without meaning. She stopped when Harrow Hark stopped, her hands clasped, and added, "I pray for our success, for the house. I pray for the lector's devoted hands of the emperor. I pray to be found pleasing in his eyes. I pray for the cavalier." This Gideon caught the dark black-rimmed eye and could imagine the mental accompaniment to choke to death on her own vomit. "Let it be so," said the lady of the ninth house. The rattling of the assorted prayer bones very nearly drowned out the clank of the shuttle docking. Gideon turned away, not meaning to make any kind of goodbye, but she saw eye glamour and crooked into a stiff salute, and realized for the first time that she might never see the woman again. God help her, she might never come back. For a moment, everything seemed dizzyingly unsure. The house continued on in grand and grisly majesty, because you were always looking at it. It continued because you watched it continue, changeless and black before your eyes. The idea of leaving him made it seem so fragile as to crumble the moment they turned their backs. Harrow Hark turned toward the shuttle, and Gideon realized with an unwelcome jolt that she was crying. Her paint was wet with tears, and then the whole idea became beautiful. The moment Gideon turned her back on it, the house would die. The moment Gideon walked away, it would all disappear. Like an impossibly bad dream, she mentally staved in the sides of the enormous shadowy cave and buried drip-burn rock, and for good measure exploded crocks like a garbage bag full of soup. But she saluted Glaman as crisply and as enthusiastically as a soldier on her first day of service, and was pleased when her teacher rolled her eyes as they pulled themselves into the shuttle, the door mechanisms sliding down with a pleasingly final hung. She leaned into Harrow, who was dubbing her eyes with enormous gravity. "The Necromancers have flinched outright. Do you want?" Gideon whispered huskily, "My hanky, I want to watch you die. Maybe known as Jessimus," she said with deep satisfaction. "Maybe, but you sure as hell won't do it here." Chapter 7. From space, the house of the first shone like fire on water, breathed in the white smoke of its atmosphere, blue like the heart of a gas-ignited flame. It burned the eye. It was absolutely lousy with water smothering it all in the bluest of blue conflagrations visible even up here with the floating chains of squares and rectangles and oblongs smudging the blue with gray and green, brown and black, the tumbled down cities and temples of a house both long dead and unkillable, a sleeping throne far away. Its king and emperor sat on his seat of office and waited, a sentinel protecting his home, but never able to return to it. The lord of the house of the first was the Lord undying, and he had not come back in over 9,000 years. Gideon Nerf pressed her face up to the plexiform window of the shuttle and looked as if she couldn't ever get enough of looking, until her eyes were red and streaming and huge migraine motes danced along the edge of her vision. All the other shutters were closed up tight, and had been for most of the trip, which had taken about an hour of rapid travel. They had been surprised to find that behind the plague's privacy barrier, Harrow Hark had coolly slid up. The moment they were inside, there was no pilot on board. The ship was being remotely piloted at great expense. There was no clearance for anybody to land at the first house without explicit invitation. There was a button to press if you needed to talk to the remote navigator, and Gideon had been eager to hear another voice. But Harrow had slid the barrier back down with an air of distinct finality. She looked worn and exhausted, even vulnerable for the journey's length. She had kept her prayer knuckles in her hands and moodily clinked them into each other. In Gideon's comics, cohort adepts always sat on packets of grave dirt to ameliorate the effects of deep space and the loss of their power source. Trust Harrow Hark not to take the placebo. Gideon had warmed herself with the thought that it was the perfect time to kick her ass up and down the shuttle, but in the end, the natural embarrassment of arriving with one's necromancer's elbows on backwards saved Harrow's life. All thoughts of ass-kicking had subsided as the approach of the first house reflected light through the open window, light that spilled into the passenger bay in fiery gouts. Gideon had to turn her face away. Half blind and breathless, Harrow was tying a piece of black voile around her eyes, as calm and uninterested as if what hung outside the window was dreary ninth sky. Gideon cut her hands over her eyes to shade them and looked again, getting her feel of the explosive brilliance outside the velvety blackness of space, with innumerable pinprick white stars, the first a searing circle of incandescent blue strewn with dazzling white, and the outsides of 7 more shuttles lining up in orbit. Gideon gave a low whistle to see them to an inhabitant of the sepulchre's 9th house. It seemed amazing that the whole thing didn't just combust and crumble into flame. There were other houses that made their homelands on planets closer to the burning star of Dominicus the 7th and the 6th, for instance. But at Gideon, they could not imaginably be anything else than 100% on fire. It was incredible. It was exquisite. She wanted to throw up. It seemed stellate insanity that Hurlhug's only reaction was to slide up the plexiform barrier and hold down the communication button to ask, "How long must we wait?" The navigator's voice crackled back, "We are securing your clearance to land, Your Grace." Harrow didn't thank him. "How long? They're scanning your craft now, Your Grace, and we'll move the moment they have confirmed you're free to leave orbit." The reverend daughter sank back into her chair, stuffing her prayer bones into a fold of her robe quite unwillingly. Gideon caught her eye. The expression on the other girl's face wasn't disinterest or distraction, as she assumed. Even through a layer revealing, she could tell that Hera was near incapacitated with concentration. Her mouth was pinched in a tight ripple, worrying the black painted blotch on the lower lip into blood. It took less than 5 minutes for the thrusters to creak to life again, for the ship to slowly glide out of orbit. Next to them in a line, 7 other shuttles were drifting to one side, sliding into the atmosphere like dominoes falling. Harrow shook her head back into her hood and pinched the bridge of her nose and said in tones between pleasure and pain, "This planet's unbelievable. It's gorgeous. It's a grave," said Harrow Hark. The shuttle broke orbit, haloed by coruscating light. This burn-off meant there was nothing to see but sky, but the sky of the first house was the same improbable, ludicrous blue as the water. Being on the outside of the planet was like living in a kaleidoscope. It was a lurting blur for long moments, a whine as air pockets in the thick atmosphere made the engine scream, a jolt as the craft repressurized to match, and then the shut was a slingshot bullet, an accelerating shell. The brightness was too much to bear. Gideon got the impression of 100 spires rising, choked with green stuff from blue and turquoise waters, before she had to squeeze her eyes shut and turn away wholesale, she pressed the fabric of the embroidered 9th robes to her face and had to breathe through her nose. Idiot Harrowhack's voice was distant and full of badly suppressed adrenaline. Here, take this veil. Gideon kept mopping at her eyes. I'm all good, I said. Put it on. Not having you struck blind when the door opens. I came prepared, my sweet. Were you even saying half the time? The glow changed, strobing, and now the shuttle was slowing down. The light cleared, brightened, dazzled. Harrowhark threw herself upon the shutter and slammed it down. She and Gideon stood in the center of the passenger bay, staring at each other. He didn't realize that Harrow was trembling. Little licks of whole black hair were pasted to her pale gray forehead, with sweat threatening to dissolve the paint. Gideon realized with the start that she was trembling and sweating in concert. They looked at each other with a wild surmise, and then started dabbing at their faces with the insides of their sleeves. Foot up, breathed Harold. Hark, hide that ridiculous hair. Your dead mummified's mother's got ridiculous hair. Griddle, we're within the planet's halo now, and I will delight in violence. A final thudding clunk, complete stillness. The seals on the outside were unlashed by some outside force, and as light blazed around the edges of the hatch, Gideon winked at her increasingly agitated companion. She said, Sadovach. But then you couldn't have admired these, and whipped on the glasses she'd unearthed back home. They were ancient smoked glass sunglasses with thin black frames and big mirrored lenses, and they grayed out Harrow's expression of incredulous horror as she adjusted them on her nose. That was the last thing she saw before the light got in. And then the outside of the first house was open to them, a rush of warm air ruffling their robes and drying the sweat on their faces. Before the hatch had even shuddered to a halt, Harrow, aggravated, had disappeared completely. Lady Harrowhark, Nona Yazimus, the reverend daughter of the House of the 9th, swept onto the docking ramp, instead counting 5 full breaths to mark time. Gideon, Nav Cavalier of the 9th House, came following behind, praying that her unfamiliar sword wouldn't tangle in her robes. They were on the enormous metal-plated dock of what must have surely been the most impressive structure the first house had ever built. It might have been the most impressive structure anyone had ever built. Gideon didn't have a lot to go on. Rearing up before them was a palace, a fortress of white and shining stone. It spread out on the surface of the water like an island. You couldn't see over it, and you could hardly see around it. It lapped back in terraces of what must have once been fabulous gardens. It rose up in gracious towers that hurt the eye with their slenderness and precision. It was a monument to wealth and beauty back in its day. At least it would have been a monument to wealth and beauty in the present. It was a castle that had been killed. Many of its white and shining towers had crumbled and fallen down in miserable chunks. Jungling overgrowth rose from the sea and wrapped around the base of the building, both green slimes and thick vines. The gardens were gray, filmy canopies of dead trees and plants. They had overtaken the windows, the balconies, the balustrades, and clung there and died. They covered much of the frontage in a secretive mist of expired matter. Gold veins shone dully in the dirty white walls. The docking bay must have also been elegant in its era, a huge landing swayed that could have held 100 ships at a time. Now 92 of the cradles were desolate and filthy. The metal was caked with salt from the water salt that now assaulted Gideon's nose, a thick briny scent overpowering and wild. The whole place had the look of a picked up body, but hot damn, what a beautiful corpse. The dock was alive with movement. 5 other ships had landed and were expelling their contents. But there was no time for that. Someone had come to meet them. Harold Hark did not care for any herald. She had drifted out like a black ship in sail, a bony figure wreathed in layers and layers of night-colored cloth, with a lace overcloak training behind her adorned with bones, painted like a dead woman, eyes blindfolded with black net. Now she dropped to her knees 5 paces from the shuttle door and began counting prayers on the knuckle beads in a click-clack monotone. Showtime. Gideon ambled over and knelt next to Harrow on the sun-warmed metal of the dock, her own robes pooling black around her, staring inscrutably at the tint-dimmed chaos of what was going on. The clacking beads made her almost feel normal. Hail to the lady of the 9th house, wobbled a voice delightedly, bringing the count of people who had ever been happy to see Harrow up to 3. Hail to her cavalier, oh hail, hail, hail to the child of the far-off and shadowed jewel of our empire. What a very happy day. A little old man stood in front of them. He was small and reedy in a way that reminded Gideon of the oldest of the House of the Ninth, but he had the straightest back and rudest good health of any old man Gideon had ever seen. He was like an old and twisted oak still covered with leaves. He was bald with a neat clipped white beard and a golden circlet at his brow. His white robe had no hood and was long enough to brush his calves, and he wore a half cloak of brushed white wool. Around his waist was a gorgeous belt. It was made of some shimmering gold stuff, and it was embroidered with a multitude of jewel colors and intricate patterns and shapes. They looked like flowers or flourishes, or both. They looked as though they had been made 1,000 years ago and kept in loving perfection. Everything about him was ageless and pristine. Harrow Hark pocketed her prayer beads. Hail to the house of the first, she interned. Hail to the king undying. Hail to the Lord over the river, quavered the little priest. And welcome to this house, blessed lady of the ninth. The reverend daughter the ninth has not visited the first house for most of this myriad, but your cavalier is not otter Snigenhart the slightest pools, or to Snigenad has abdicated his post, said Harrow from the depths of her hood. Gideon Nav has taken his place as cavalier primary. I am the lady. Harrow Hark Nona Jezumus, then welcome to the lady Nona Jesimus, and to Gideon the ninth. Once you have finished your prayers, so the little priest effervescently, you must stand and be honored and come into the sanctum. I am a keeper of the first house and a servant to the Necro Lord highest, and you must call me teacher, not due to my own merits of learning, because I stand in the stead of the merciful God above death, and I live in hope that one day you will call him teacher, and you may call him master too. And may I call you then Hero Hawk the first. Be at rest, Lady Nona Jesimus, be at rest. Gideon the ninth. Gideon the ninth, who would have paid cash to be called absolutely anything else, rose as her mistress rose. They exchanged glances that, even through one layer revealing and one layer of tinted glass, were violently hostile. But there was too much going on to stand and pull go to hell faces at each other. Gideon saw other white-robed figures darting to and fro between the shuttles coming out of open double doors, but it took a moment to realize that these were skeletons in plain white with white knots at their waists. They were using long metal poles to work the mechanisms that held the shuttles safely coupled to their latches, with that strange log step oneness in which the dead always worked. And then there were the living waiting in tubes, awkwardly shuffling their feet next to their ships. She had never seen so many different people, so many people not of the ninth, and it almost dizzied her, but not enough so that she couldn't pick out when something was amiss. I only count 6 shuttles, said Gideon. Harrow Hark shot her a look for speaking out of turn, but the little priest teacher cackled as though he were pleased. Oh well, notice, very good. Yes, there's a discrepancy, he said, and we don't much like discrepancies. This is holy land. We might be called over careful, but we hold this house as sacred to the emperor our lord. We do not get many visitors as you might think. There is nothing that much the matter, he added, and with a confiding air. It's the house of the third and the house of the seventh. No matter, I'm sure they will be given clearance any moment now. We needed clarification and inconsistency in both. Inconsistency, repeated Hero Hawk, as though she were rolling the word around her mouth like a sweet yes. The house of the third will of course push the boundaries, of course they would, and the house of the seventh, well, it's well known. Look, they're landing now. Most of the other heirs and cavaliers had left their shuttles, and the skeletons were busy pulling luggage out from their holds. The last 2 shuttles slowly spiraled down to earth, a fresh gust of warm winds scything over everyone as they came to their fluttering rest. Skeletons with poles were already there to greet them, and other living priests, one for each arriving shuttle. They were alive and well dressed in identical vestments to teachers. This made just 3 priests total, which made Gideon wonder why the ninth always scored so much geriatric attention. The 2 new shuttles had both alighted next to the ninth, the seventh's closest, and the third's one over, which was close enough to see who or what was inside. As the third's hatch opened, Gideon was hugely interested to see 3 figures emerge. The first was a rather sulky young man with an air of hair gel and filigree, an ornate rapier at the belt of his button coat, the cavalier. The other 2 were young women, both blonde, though the similarity ended there. One girl was tall and statuesque with a star-white grin and masses of bright gold curls. The other girl seemed smaller and substantial, with a sheet of hair the anemic color of Ken butter and an equally bloodless smirk. They were actually the same height. Gideon realized her brain had just deemed that proposition to too stupid to credit on first pass. It was as though the second girl were the starved shadow of the first, or the first, an illuminated reflection. The boy just looked bit of a dick. Gideon rubbernecked until a white-robed priest with another party-colored belt hurried over from the trio to them, tapping on teacher's shoulder and murmuring in worried, half-heard snatches were inflexible, the household's backing born at the exact. Both the adept teacher waved it off with an indulgent hand and a wheezing laugh. What can we do? What can we do? But it's impossible, only trouble at the end of the line, he said, and a trouble confined to them. Once the other priest had gone, Harrow Hark said repressively, twins are an ill-omened. Teacher seemed tickled. How delightful to hear someone saying ill-omen could come from the mouth of the emperor. From the shuttle that carried the seventh house came consternation. The skeletons had pried the hatch open, and someone taught it out in what felt like painful slow motion, like time had decided to slow to a gruesome cruel to show itself off. They had fainted dead away into the arms of the waiting priest, an old man who was singularly unprepared for it. His legs and arms were buckling. The figure was dragging on the ground, threatening to spill entirely. There was red blood on the priest's front. He cried out. Gideon never ran unless she had to, and Gideon ran now. Her legs moved as swiftly as her awful judgment, and all of a sudden she was scooping the crumpled, drooping figure out of the priest's buckling arms, lowering his cargo to the ground as he murmured in amazement. In response, the ice-cold point of a blade bit gently through her hood to the back of her neck, right up to the base of her skull. Yo, said Gideon, her head absolutely still. Step off. The sword did not step off. This isn't a warning, she said. I'm just saying, give her some air. For the person folded up in Gideon's arms seemed to her he was a slender young thing whose mouth was a brilliant red with blood. Her dress was a frivolous concoction of seafoam green frills, the blood on it startling against such a backdrop. Her skin seemed transparent, horribly transparent, with the veins at her hands and the sides of her temples a visible cluster of moved branches and stems. Her eyes fluttered open. They were huge and blue with velvety brown lashes. The girl coughed up a clot, which ruined the tableau, and those big blue eyes widened in dismay. Tessa, Lois said the girl, stand down. When the sword didn't move an inch, she coughed again and said unhappily, stand down, you goof. You're going to get us in trouble. Gideon felt the pressure and the edge remove itself from her neck, and she let out of breath. Not for long, though. It was replaced with a gloved hand pressing over the place where the blade had been, a hand which was pressing down as though its owner would quite like to punch her occipital bone into crumbs. That hand could belong to only one person. Gideon braced to be dropped headfirst into the shitter, and Harrow Hark's voice emerged as though it had been dredged up from the bottom of a channel house. Your cavalier, said the lady of the ninth, quietly drew on my cavalier as Gideon died gently of shock, boiled back to this life only by the weird bruises forming at the top of her spine. The other girl broke out into miserable coughs. I'm so sorry, she said. He's just overprotective. He never would have meant. Oh my God, your black vestos. Oh my God, you're the ninth curve. The girl in Gideon's lap covered her face and seemed to break into sobs, but it became apparent that they were gurgles of myth. You've done it now, Pro, she gasped. They could demand satisfaction, and you'd end up a mausoleum centerpiece, lady, or lord of the knights. Please accept my heartfelt apologies. He was hasty, and I was a fool. Come on, said Gideon. You fainted. I do that, she admitted, and gave another wicked chuckle of delight. This appeared to be the greatest thing that had ever happened to her. She fluttered her hands like she was having the vapors. Oh God, I was rescued by a shadow cultist. I was so sorry. Thank you. This is one for the history books. Now that the threat of violence had passed, the priest with difficulty had dropped to his knees. He unwound the exquisite prismatic scarf at his waist and hesitated before her. The girl gave an imperious little nod, and he began wiping the blood away from her mouth, reverential, seeming far less worried about the entire mess than Gideon. Didn't know, discouraged, disconcerted. Duchess Septimus, he said in a tweedling old voice, and is it so advanced as all that? Yes indeed, oh lady, he said sadly. You should not have come. She gave a flashing sudden smile, the edges of her teeth scarlet. But isn't it beautiful that I did, she said, and looked up at Gideon and strained past her to look at Harrow and clasped her hands together. Protesters, help me up so that we can apologize. I can't believe I get to look real to maidens in the face. Great rugged arms thrust past Gideon's vision and the girl in her lap was lifted up by a 6-foot collection of sinews. The man who'd put the sword to her neck was uncomfortably buff. He had upsetting biceps. He didn't look healthy. He looked like a collection of lemons in a sack. He was a dour, bulky person whose skin had something of the girl's strange translucent tinge. He was waxing looking in the sunlight, probably with sweat, and he wore the girl half draped over his shoulder as though she were a baby or a rug. Gideon sized him up. He was dressed richly, but with clothes that looked as though they'd seem practical, wear a long cape of washed-out green and a belted kilt and boots. There was a shining length of etched chain rolled up and over his arm, and a big swept hilt rapier hung at his hip. He was staring at Gideon emptily. "You gigantic," she thought, "but you move awkwardly, and I bet I could take you." The hand at the back of her neck relaxed a fraction. Gideon didn't even get a hard flick to the skull, which bodied ill. Whatever punishment Hero was going to mete out would be meted out later in private, and viciously she'd screwed up, but couldn't quite regret it. As Gideon brushed herself off and picked herself up to stand, the lady of the 7th house was smiling. Her babyish face made it difficult to give her a time stamp. She might have been 17 or 37. "What must I do to gain forgiveness?" she said. "If my house blasphemes against the house of the 9th in the first 5 minutes, I'm going to feel like a bore." "Keep your sword off my cavalier," said Hera in tones of the sepulchre. "You heard her," said the girl. "You can't just get your rapier out filly-nilly." Princess Allows did not deign to reply. His gaze fixed on Gideon. In the awkward silence that resulted, the girl added, "But now, I can thank you for your aid. I'm Lady Dulcinea Septimus, Duchess of Castle Raids, and this is my Cavalier Primary Protestless the 7th. The 7th house thanks you for your gracious assistance." Despite this pretty even coaxing introduction, Gideon's lady merely bowed her hooded head, her bound eyes giving away nothing. It was with glacial disregard that she said, "The 9th house wishes health to the Lady Septimus and prudence to protest." Allows the 7th turned on her heel and left. In an abrupt swish of black cloth, Gideon was obliged to turn heel and move after her. She wasn't such a foolish to stay, but before she left she caught the Lady Dulcinea's eye. Rather than being missish or horrified, she looked as though giving offense to the house of the 9th might prove the highlight of her life. Gideon swore that she was even favored. With a coy wink, they left the priest of the 1st house there to worry, brow furrowed, folding his scarf, now encrusted with blood. They'd caused a general ruckus. The curious eyes of the other adepts and their cavaliers rested upon the black-robed 9th. Gideon was discomforted to find the gaze of the bloodless 3rd twin on her and Hera Hark, both her pale eyes like sniper sights, her mouth exquisitely chill. There was something in her stare that Gideon disliked on impact, and she held that gaze until the pale head was dropped. As the teacher's expression, well, that one was hard to fathom. In the end, it was something like melancholy and something like resignation, and he did not say a word about what Gideon had done. "A blood floor runs through the ruling house of the 7th was all he said, sparing most who carry the gene, but fatal to a few. Hera Hark as teacher was the Lady Septimus, so diagnosed. Dulcinea Septimus was not meant to live to 25, said the little priest. Come along, we are all here now, and we've had ample excitement. What a day, we will have something to talk about, won't we?" 25, thought Gideon, distantly ignoring the ugly twist beneath Hera's veil that promised that there would be much to talk about later, and that it would not go well for Gideon. 25 years, and Hera Hark was probably going to live forever. They billowed obediently into the priest's wake, and Gideon remembered the coy wink and felt terribly sad. Chapter 8. They were bidden to sit in a vast atrium, a cavern of a room, a 9th house mausoleum of a room, except that through the glorious wreck of the smeared and vaulted ceiling light streamed down in such quantities it made Gideon halfway blind again. There were deep couches and seating benches with cracked covers, and the stuffing coming out with broken arm guards and backs embroidered throws that clung to the seats like the skins of mummies, piebald where the light had touched them and dank where it hadn't. Everything in that room was beautiful, and all had gone to seed. It wasn't like back in the 9th wherein beautiful things were now old and ruined. To boot, the 9th must have always been a corpse, and corpses putrefied. The house of the 1st had been abandoned and breathlessly waited to be used by someone other than time. The floors were of wood where they weren't of gold shot marble or a rainbow mosaic of tiles gone leprous with age and despair. and enormous twin staircases jotted up to the floor above, spread with narrow moth-eaten rugs. Vines peeked through in number where the glass of the ceiling had cracked, spreading tendrils that had since gone gray, and dry. The pillars that reached up to support the shining glass were carpeted thickly with moss, still alive, still radiant, all orange and green and brown. It obscured old portraits on the walls in spatters of black and tan. It hung atop an old dry fountain made of marble and glass 3 tiers deep, a little bit of standing water still skulking in the bottom bowl. Harrow Hark refused to sit. Gideon stood next to her, feeling the hot wet air glue the black folds of her robe to her skin. The cavalier of the 7th Betrayal didn't sit either. She noticed not until his mistress patted the chair next to her own, and then he folded down. With unhesitating obedience, the white-garbed skeleton circulated. Trays filled with cups of astringent tea, steaming green, funny little cups with no handles, hot and smooth to the touch like stone, but smoother and thinner. The 7th Cavalier held his, but did not drink it. His adept tried to drink, but had a minor coughing fit that lasted until she gestured for her cavalier to thump her on the back. As the other necromancers and cavaliers drank with varied enjoyment, Harrow Hark held her cup as though it were a live slug. Gideon, who had never drunk a drink hot in all her days, knocked back half in one gulp. It burned all the way down her throat, more smell than flavor, and left a grassy tongue on her cauterized taste buds. Some of her lip paint stayed on the rim. She choked discreetly. The reverend daughter gave her a look that withered the bowels. All 3 priests sat at the lip of the fountain, holding their teacups unzipped in their hands, unless they were hiding a bunch more in some cupboard. It seemed terrifically lonely to Gideon. The second was the tottery priest, his frail shoulders bowing as he fretted with his blood-stained belt. The third was mild of face and sported a long salt and pepper plait. They might have been a woman, and might have been a man, and might have been neither. All 3 wore the same clothes, which gave them the look of white birds on rainbow leashes. But somehow Teacher was the only one of the 3 who seemed real. He was eager, interested, vital, alive. The penitent calm of his fellows made them seem more like the robed skeletons arrayed at the sides of the room, silent and immovable, with a red speck of light dancing in each socket. Once everyone was awkwardly perched on the exquisite wrecks of furniture, finishing their tea, clutching their cups with the gushery of people who didn't know where to put them, making zero conversation. Salt and Pepper Plant raised their pale voice and said, "Now let us pray for the Lord of that which was destroyed, remembering the abundance of his pity, his power, and his love." Gideon and Harrow Hark were silent during the ensuing chant. Let the King, undying ransomer of death, scourge of death, vindicator of death, look upon the 9 houses and hear their thanks. Let the whole of everywhere entrust themselves to him. Let those across the river pledge beyond the tomb to the adept divine, the first among necromancers. Thanks be to the 9-fold resurrection. Thanks be to the liquor divinely ordained. He is emperor, and he became God. He is God, and he became Emperor. Gideon had never heard this one. There was only one prayer on the 9th. All other services were cool and speaks or knucklebone Arison. Most of the crowd rattled it off as though they'd been saying it from the cradle, but not all. The hulking, massive man meat Protessa Lois stared straight ahead without even mouthing the words, his lips as still as the pale third twins. The others joined in without hesitation, though with varying further. Once the last word had sunk into silence, Teacher said, "And perhaps the devout of the locked tomb will favor us with their intercession." Everyone's heads twisted their way. Gideon froze. It was the reverend daughter who maintained complete equanimity as she dropped her cup into Gideon's hands. And before a sea of faces, some curious, some bored, and one Dulcine's enthusiastic, Hero began, "I pray the tomb is shot forever. I pray the rock is never rolled away." Gideon had known on some basic level that the religion practiced in the dark depths of Dreba was not quite the religion practiced by the other houses. It was still a shock to the system to have it confirmed by the expressions on some of the faces, bewildered or blank or long-suffering, or in at least one case openly hostile. The others hadn't been confronted with it either. By the time Hero had finished, the 3 priests looked softly delighted, just as it always was. Sight, the little bent priest in ecstasy despite the wretched dirge. "Continuity is a marvelous thing," said Salt and Pepper Plant, proving themselves insanely tedious. Teacher said, "Now I'll welcome you to Canaan House. Will someone bring me the box?" The gangling silence focused on a robed skeleton who carried over a small chest, made entirely of wood. It was no wider than a book and no deeper than 2 books stacked on top of each other, estimated Gideon, who thought of all books as being basically the same size. Teacher threw it open with a prom and announced Marta, the second, an intensely dark girl. Snapped to attention, her salute was as crisp as her flawless cohort uniform. And when teacher beckoned, she marched forward with a gait as starched as her officer's scarlets and snowy white necktie. As though bestowing a jewel upon her, he gave her a dull iron ring from the box, about as big around as the circle made by a thumb and forefinger. To her credit, she did not gawk or hesitate. She simply took it, saluted, and sat back down. Teacher called out Naberius III, and thus followed a rather tiresome parade of rapious swinging cavaliers in varying attitudes coming up to receive their mysterious iron circles. Some of them took the second's cue in saluting others, including the man Hulk. Protezalawas bothered not at all. Gideon's tension grew with each name. When at last, in this roll call, teacher said Gideon the Ninth, she ended up disappointed by the banality of the thing. It was not a perfect iron loop, as she had thought, but a twist that overlapped itself and locked shut by means of a hole balled into one end and a 90-degree bend the other, so that you could prise it open simply by fiddling the bend back through the hole. The metal in her hand felt granular heavy. When she returned to her place, she knew Harrow was sweating to snatch it off her, but she clutched it childishly tight. Nobody asked what it was, which Gideon thought was fairly friggin' dumb. She was near to asking herself when teacher said, now the tenets of the first house and the grief of the king undying. Everyone got very focused again. I will not tell you what you already know, said the little priest. I seek only to add context. The lickers were not born immortal. They were given eternal life, which is not at all the same thing. 16 of them came here a myriad ago, 8 adepts, and the 8 who would later be known as the first Cavaliers. And it was here that they ascended. Those 8 necromancers were first after the Lord of Resurrection. They have spread his assumption across the blackness of space to those places where others could never reach. Each of them alone is more powerful than 9 cohorts acting as one. But even the divine lickers can pass away despite their power and despite their swords. And they have done so slowly over these 10,000 years. The Emperor's grief has waxed with time. It is only now, in the twilight of the original 8, that he has listened to his last lectors, who begged for reinforcement. He took his cup of tea and swirled the liquid with a twitch of his wrist. You have been nominated to attempt the terrible challenge of replacing them, he said. And it is not at all a sure thing if you ascend to liquor, or if you try and fail. The kindly Lord knows what is being asked of you is titanic. You are the honored heirs and guardians of the 8 houses. Great duties await you. If you do not find yourself a galaxy, it is not so bad to find yourself a star, nor to have the Emperor know that the both of you attempted this great ordeal. All of you, added the little priest, brightly nodding at the twins and their Solanus Cavalier with a flash of amusement. As the case may be, Cavaliers, if your adept is found wanting, you have failed. If you are found wanting, your adept has failed. And if one or both is wanting, then we will not ask you to wreck your lives against this impossible task. You will not be forced if you cannot continue onward through single or mutual failure, or make the decision not to go on. He looked searchingly over the assembled faces, somewhat vague, as though seeing them for the first time. Gideon could hear Harrow Hark chewing the inside of her cheek, fingers tightly knuckled over her prayer bones. Teacher said, this is not a pilgrimage where your safety is assured. You will undergo trials, possibly dangerous ones. She will work hard. You will suffer. I must speak candidly. You may even die, but I see no reason not to hope that I may behold 8 new lickers by the end of this. Joined together with their cavaliers, heir to a joy and power that has sung through 10,000 years. They sank into the room like water into sand. Even Gideon got a minute to chill down the back of her neck. He said, to practical matters, your every need will be met here. You will be given your own rooms and will be waited on by the servants. There is space in abundance. Any chambers not given to others may be used as you will for your studies and your sitting rooms, and you have the run of all open spaces and the use of all books. We live as penitents, do simple food, no letters, no visits. You shall never use a communication network. It is not allowed in this place. Now that you are here, you must understand that you are here until we send you home, or until you succeed. We hope you will be too busy to be lonely or bored. As for your instruction here, This is what the first house asks of you. The room drew breath together, or the necromancers did alongside a goodly proportion. Of their cavaliers, Harrow's knuckles whitened. Gideon wished that she could flop into a seat or take a sly nap. Everybody was poisoned. Readiness for the outline syllabus and scholarship made her want to die. There would be some listening of how breakfast would take place every morning at this time, and then there'd be study with the priests for an hour, and then skeleton analysis and history of some blood and tomb studies, and like lunchtime, and finally double bones with Dr. Skeleton. The most she could hope for was swords 2, and maybe swords 3. We asked, began teacher, that you never open a locked door unless you have permission. Everyone waited. Nothing happened. They looked at the little priest, and he looked back completely at his ease, his hands resting on his white-clad thighs, smiling vaguely. The nail went ping out of a rotting picture frame somewhere in the corner. That's it, said teacher helpfully. Gideon saw lights dull in every eye that it gleamed for double bones with Dr. Skeleton. Someone ventured a bit timidly. So what is the training then? How to attain liquor? Who? The little priest looked at them again. Well, I don't know, he said. His words went through them all like lightning. The very air chilled. Anticipation for double bones with Dr. Shellbone not only died, but was buried deep down in some forgotten catacomb. It only took one look at teacher's kind, open-hearted countenance to confirm that he was not in fact screwing with them. They were stupefied with confusion and outrage. You're the ones who will ascend to lector, he said. Not me. I am certain the way will become clear to you without any input from us. Why, who are we to teach the first after the king undying? Then he added smilingly, welcome to Canaan House. A skeleton took Gideon and Harrow to the wing that had been set aside for the 9th. They were led deep into the fortress of the first, past ruined statuary within the gorgeous wreck of Canaan House. The wraith-like mansion-like hull climbs sprawled and chipped around them. They passed rooms with vaulted ceilings full of green light where the sun shone through thick algae on the glass. They passed broken windows and windows wrecked with salt and wind, and open shadowed arches where reeked rooms too musty to be believed. They said absolutely jack to each other except when they were taken down flights of stairs to their rooms, and Gideon looked out the windows now into the featureless lumps of blackness and said thoughtlessly, the lights are broken. Harrow turned to her for the first time since they left the shuttle, eyes glittering like beetles beneath the veil, mouth puckered up like a cat's asshole. Riddle, she said, this planet spins much faster than ours. That Gideon's continued blank expression. It's night, you tool. They did not speak again. The removal of the light strangely made Gideon feel very tired. She couldn't escape its having been there, even though Dreeber's brightest was darker than the darkest shadows of the first. The wing turned out to be low on the level right beneath the dock. There were a few lights here outside the huge windows, making big blue shadows out of the iron struts that held up the landing platform above them. Far below, the sea ruled invisibly. There was a bed for Harrow, an enormous platform with feathery tatted drapes, and a bed for Gideon, except that it was placed at the foot of Harrow Hark's bed, which she could not have nuked at harder. She sat herself up with a mass of musty bedding and pillows in front of a huge window in the next room, and left Harrow back in the bedroom with a black expression and probably blacker thoughts. Gideon was too tired even to wash her face or undress properly. Exhaustion had spread upward through her toes, spiking up her calves, freezing the bottom of her spine as she stared out the window into the bluish blackness of night. After a day, she heard a huge overhead grinding sound, a big velvety pool of metal on metal, a rhythmic scrape. Gideon watched paralyzed as one of the very expensive shuttles fell hugely and silently over the landing platform. It dropped like a suicide and seemed to hang gray and shining in the air. Then it fell from sight to its left, another, farther left, another. The scraping ceased. Skeletal feet pattered away. Gideon fell asleep. Act 2, Chapter 9. Gideon woke to an unfamiliar ceiling, a fuzzy taste on her tongue, and the exciting smell of mold. The light blazed in red slashes even through her eyelids, and it made her come to all at once for long moments. She just laid back in her nest of old bedding and looked around. The 9th quarters had low ceilings and wide, sweeping rooms decaying away, and magnificence before enormous floor-to-ceiling windows. The dock above their quarters cast a long shadow outside, cooling and dimming the light which gleamed quietly off the chandeliers of festooned black crystals on wire. It would have been muted and peaceful too, someone used to it. But to Gideon on her first morning, it was like looking at a headache someone had a very long time ago dressed these apartments lavishly in dead jewel colors, dark ruby, dark sapphire, dark emerald. The doors were set above the main level and reached by sloping stone ramps. There was not a great deal of furniture that wasn't sighing apart. The meanest stick of it still outclassed the most exquisite 9th heirlooms back home. Gideon took a particular fancy to the long, low table in the center of their living room, and set with black glass. The first thing she did was roll away and reach for her sword. Glamon had spent half of training simply convincing Gideon to reach for her rapier hilt rather than her to hand her, to the point where she'd been sleeping with her fingers on the thing to try to get used to it. There was a note crumpled between her hand and the basket. "Don't talk to anybody." "Guess I won't talk to anybody," said Gideon. "But then read on. I have taken the ring." "Hello," Gideon bellowed impotently and slapped her hands down into her pockets. The ring was gone. There was no mistake greater or stupider than to let Harrow hark Nona Jizumas at you when you were in any way vulnerable. She should have booby-trapped the threshold. It wasn't like she even cared about the ring. It was just a cut again and again of Hero considering all of Gideon's property her property in common. She tried to cheer herself up with the thought that this at least meant Hero wasn't around, a thought that would have cheered up anyone. Gideon shrugged off her robe and wrestled out of her trousers and shirt, all of which had hot and damp insides from her sweat. She opened doors until she found the largest bathroom she had ever seen. It was so big she could walk around in it. She stretched out her arms on either side and still couldn't touch the walls, which were of slippery stone glowing like coals where they were whole and schooled and dull where they weren't. Maybe this pretending to be a cavalier gig wasn't so bad after all. The floor was marble tile sheen marred by only a few spots of black mold. There was a bowl with taps that Gideon knew to be a sink only because she'd read a lot of comics, and an enormous person-sized recess in the ground that she didn't know what to do with it all. The sonic cleaner was set gleaming gently at either side of a rectangular chamber with a weird nozzle. Gideon pulled a lever next to the tap. Water gushed from the nozzle, and she yelped and skidded away before she got over the site and turned it off. Her survey identified a chubby cake of soap next to the sink, but 9th soap had been made of human fat, so no thanks, and a tub of Anabac gel. She decided eventually to take a Sonic and to use the gel to scrape the blurred paint off her face. Newly clean, with fresh clothes and her robes shaken out in the Sonic, she was feeling good about herself until she aspired. Another note stuck tersely on the auto door. "Fix your face, idiot." There was another note atop the paint box, which some skeletal servant had helpfully placed on one of the less precarious sideboards. "Do not try to find me. I am working. Keep your head down and stay out of trouble. I reiterate the order that you do not talk to anybody." Another note was stuck beneath belatedly to clarify. "Anybody is a word that refers to any person alive or dead inside the box." Yet another "paint your face adequately," Gideon said aloud. "Your parents must have been so relieved to die." Back in the bathroom, she smeared cold wards of alabaster on her face. The nun's paint went on in pale grays and blacks, swabbed over the lips and the hollows of her eyes and cheeks. Gideon comforted herself by recoiling at her reflection in the cracked mirror, a grinning death's head with a crop of incongruously red hair and a couple of zits. She pulled her sunglasses out of the pocket of her robe and eased them on, which completed the effect. If the effect you wanted was horrible, feeling slightly more atheist with life rapier bobbing at her hip, it was the Cavalier of the 9th who stalked down the dilapidated corridors of Canaan House. It was pleasantly quiet. She heard the far-off sounds of a lived-in-place footsteps, blurry moans from the auto cooler, the unmistakable pitter-pat of footbones on tattered rugs, and she retraced her steps to the original atrium. From there she followed her nose led her to a hot, glass-topped hall. Modern conveniences haphazardly pasted atop ancient riches, out of place among the tapestries and gone black filigree. There was netting spread all over the rafters to keep out the birds, because the glass-topped roof had holes in it that you could jump through. A fountain of fresh water bubbled at the wall, ringed in old concrete with a filtration tank snuggled beside. And there were many long-worn tables, wooden slabs that had been freshened up with Anabac and had legs that must have come from 8 table sacrifices. The place could have seated 50. The early light flooded down in electric yellow blasts, green where it touched the living plants and brown where it touched the dead ones, and she was grateful that she'd worn her glasses. The room was nearly empty, but a couple of the others were there finishing their meals. Gideon sat down 3 tables away and spied on them shamelessly. There was a man sitting close to a pair of ghastly teens younger than Gideon, still in the midst of losing their fight with puberty. The boy wore trim navy robes, and the girl had a jeweled scabbard on her back. And when Gideon entered, they had looked up at the cultist of the 9th with unabashed interest. Close to all, the man close to this horrible pair had a kind, jovial face and curly hair with clothes of excellent cut and a gorgeously wrought rapier at his side. Gideon reckoned him well into his 30s. He had the guts to raise his hand to her in a tentative greeting. Before she could do anything in return, a skeleton placed a steaming bowl of sour green soup and a massive hunk of lardy yeast bread on the table, and she got busy eating. These were sophisticated skeletons. Hers returned with a cup of hot tea on a tray and waited until she took it to retreat. Gideon had noticed that their fine motor control would have been the envy of any necromancer, that they moved with perfect concert and awareness. She was in a position of some expertise. Here, you couldn't spend any time in the 9th house without coming away with an unwholesome knowledge of skeletons. She could have easily filled in for Dr. Skullabone without practicing a single theorem. The sheer amount of complex programming each skeleton followed would have taken all of the oldest and most gnarled necromancers of the locked tomb months and months to put together. Gideon would have been impressed, but she was too hungry. The awful teens were muttering to each other, Gideon looks, giving each other looks, and muttering again. The wholesome older man leaned over and gave them some bracing rebuke. They subsided reluctantly, only casting the occasional dark glance her way over their soup and bread, not knowing that she was physically immune. Back in the 9th, she had endured each meal under Crux's fantastically dismal stare, which had turned gruel into ash in her mouth. A waiting white-robed bone servant relieved her of her bowl and her plate almost sooner than she was done. She was quietly sucking teeth through her teeth, trying not to drink half a pint of face paint with it, when a hand was stuck out in front of her. It was the hand of the kind-faced older man. Up close, he had a strong jaw, the expression of the terminally jolly, and nice eyes. Gideon was genuinely surprised to find that she was shy, and more still to find she was relieved by Harrow's diktat against talking. Gideon Naff, absolutely goddamn starved of any contact with people who didn't have dark missiles and advanced osteoporosis, should have yearned to talk, but she found that she couldn't imagine a single thing to say. Magnus V, he said so. Magnus Quinn, Cavalier Primary and Senatorial of Conyotus Court, from 3 tables over. The loathsome teens greeted his audacity with low moans. They lost all appearance of restrained respectability and instead chorused his name in slow, hurt animal noises, lowing Magnus, which he ignored. Gideon had hesitated too long in taking his hand, and with the very soul of manners, he mistook her reluctance for refusal and rapped his knuckles on the table. Instead, "Do forgive us," he said. "We're a bit short on black priests in the 4th and the 5th, and my valiant 4th companions are a bit overcome." "No, Magnus, don't say we're overcome," moaned the nasty girl. "Sort of virtue, don't mention us," Magnus moaned the other. Gideon clattered her chair back to stand. Magnus Quinn, Magnus of the 5th, was too old and too well schooled to do anything so stupid as flinch, but some reputation of the 9th house that Gideon had only barely begun to comprehend widened his eyes just a bit. His clothes were so restrained and so beautifully made. He looked trim and tasteful without being intimidating. She hated herself for hearing his voice low and urgent in her hind brain. "We are not becoming an appendix of the 3rd or 5th houses." She nodded to him somewhat awkwardly, and he was so relieved that he pumped his chin up and down twice in response. Before he caught himself, "Health to the 9th," he said firmly, and then jerked his head, and what was so transparently come on clear off motion that even the bad teens couldn't ignore it. They pushed their bowls away to waiting hunched skeletons and tiptoed out in the older man's wake, leaving Gideon amused and alone. She stood there until their voices died away. "Really, Chops," she caught Magnus saying repressively, "anyone would think you'd both been raised in a barn." Before she twitched her sunglasses up her nose and left, sticking her hands in the pockets of her robes and heading out in the opposite direction from where Magnus and the crap 4th house youths had gone down a short flight of stairs. Gideon had nowhere to go and nothing to be, and no orders, and no goals, her black robe flapping at her ankles, and the light getting stronger all the time she decided to wander. Canaan House was a nest of rooms and corridors of sudden courtyards, and staircases that dripped down into lightless gloom and terminated in big rusting doors beneath overhangs, ones that looked as though they would go clang no matter how quietly you tried to shut them. More than once Gideon turned a corner and found she was back at some landing she thought she had traveled miles and miles away from. Once she pulled on a blasted terrace outside, gazing at the rusting hulking pillars that stuck up in a ring around the tower. The sea on one side was broken up, with flat concrete landings, like stepping stones set wet and geometric in the water, mummified in seaweed. The sea had covered up more structures long ago, and they looked like square heads, with long sticky hair peering up suspiciously through the waves. Being outside made her feel dizzy, so she headed back inside. There were doors, a multiplicity of doors, a veritable warehouse of doors, cupboard doors, metal auto doors, barred doors to dimly lit passageways, beyond doors half her height, with no handles, doors half rotted, so you could voyeuristically look through their nakedness to the rooms they didn't hide. All these doors must have been beautiful, even the ones that led only to broom cupboards. Whoever had lived in the first house had lived in beauty. Once the ceilings were still high and gracious, the plaster molding still graceful ornaments, but the whole thing creaked, and at one point Gideon's boot went clean through a particularly soft bit of floorboard to empty space. Below it was a death trap. She went down a short flight of cramped metal stairs. The house often seemed to split its level without letting her travel very far, but this was farther down and darker than any steps had taken her before. They led to a tiled vestibule where the lights fizzed disconsolately and refused to come on all the way. She pushed open two enormous groaning doors, which led into an echoing chamber that made her nostrils flare. It smelled badly of chemicals, and most of the smell came from the huge, filthy, perfectly rectangular pit that dominated the center of the room. The pit was lined with dull tile, and it gave the filthiest and oldest parts of the ninth house a run for their money. There were metal ladders going down into the pit, but why would you though? Gideon abandoned the pit and peered through a set of grubby glass double doors from the other side of the room. Beyond, a hunched, cloaked figure peered back at her, and she reflexively went for her rapier. The hunched figure swiftly, identically went for its own good-going dickhead, thought Giddy, and straightening up, it's a mirror. It was a mirror, an enormous one, that covered the far wall. She pressed her face closer to the glass door. The room beyond had a flagstone floor, stones worn smooth from years and years of feet. There was a rusting basin and tap where one love-abandoned towel had set for God only knew how long, decayed to a waterfall of spiderous threads. Corroded swords were bolted to corroded panels on the wall. Through a window somewhere high up, the sunbeams poured down, dusting golden torrents. Gideon would have dearly loved this training room in its prime, but she wouldn't touch those rusted blades now if you paid her. Going back to the vestibule with the spitting lights, she noticed another door set close to the staircase. She hadn't seen it before because a tapestry covered it almost entirely, but one of the corners had slipped and hinted at the frame beneath. She pushed the moldering old tapestry aside to find a dark wooden door. She tried its handle, pulled it open, and stared. A long tiled corridor stared back, windowless, a succession of square lights in the ceiling hurrying to life with a clunk, 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 and tracing a path to an enormous door at the other end, totally out of place, bracketed by heavy pillars set with forbidding stone supports. The overall effect was not exactly welcoming. The door itself was a crossbar of black stones set in a beveled frame of the same. A weird relief was carved above the lintel set within a molded panel. Gideon's boots echoed down the shiny stone tiles. As she came closer to see, the relief was 5 little circles joined with lines in no pattern that Gideon recognized. Below this sat a solid stone beam with carved leaves swagged horizontally from one end to the other. At the apex of each swag was carved an animal skull with long horns which carved inward into wicked points that almost met slim columns reached up to support this weird stone bunting, and wound around each column was something carved to seem writhing and alive, a fat slithering thing bulging. An animal. Gideon reached out to touch the intricately carved marble and felt tiny overlapping scales touch the seam where its reached underbelly met its back. It was very cold. There was no handle, no knocker, no knob, just a dark keyhole for teeth that would have been as long as Gideon's thumb. She peered through the keyhole and saw jack shit. Suffice to say, all pushing, gripping, finger inserting, and pressing was in vain. It was locked as damn curious, thought Gideon. She went back to the claustrophobic little vestibule, and out of a complete sense of perversity tacked the tapestry back up so that the door was totally covered in the shadows. The effect was very good. Nobody'd be finding that one anytime soon. It was a stupid, secretive ninth thing to do, done out of habit, and Gideon hated how comforting it felt. Voices were fading into the edge of her hearing from the top of the landing, that LED to the stairs. Another ninth instinct had Gideon flatten herself back into the bottom of the stairwell than a million times before to avoid the Marshal of Dribba, or Harrow Hark, or one of the godful great aunts, or members of the locked tomb cloister. Gideon had no idea whom she was avoiding, but she avoided them anyway, because it was such an easy thing to do. A conversation conducted in low, rich, peevish tones drifted down mystical oblique claptrap. Someone was saying, "And I have half a line to write to your father and complain what drawed another, that the first house isn't treating us fairly. A lateral puzzle isn't a trial. And now that I think about it, the idea that the old Fergie doesn't know a thing about it is beyond belief. Some geriatric playing mind games or worse. And this is my theory, wanting to see who breaks ever." The conspiracy theorist said the second voice. The first voice was aggrieved. "Why the shuttle's gone? Why is this place such a tip? Why the secrecy? Why is the food so bad? QED is a conspiracy." There was a thoughtful pause. "I didn't think the food was that bad." So the third voice, "I'll tell you what it is," continued the first voice. "It's a cheap cohort style enlisted man's hazing. They're waiting to see who's stupid enough to take the bait, who falls for it. You see, well, I shan't unless." So the second voice, which now that Gideon was hearing it was very like the third voice in pitch and tone, differentiated only by effect. "The challenge is one of protocol. We have to provide a valid response to a necessarily vague question in order to authenticate ourselves, making meaning from the meaningless, etc." The first voice had taken on a tinge of a whine when it said, "Oh, for God's sake." Scuffle movement. The stairs echoed with footsteps. They were coming down. "I do wonder where that funny old man hit the shuttles," used the third voice. The second, "Drop them off the side of the dark, I expect." "Don't be mad," said the first. "Those things cost a fortune." At the bottom of the stairs, deep in the shadows, Gideon got her first good glimpse of the speakers. The strange twin Cylons of the third house were looking around, attended to by their sulky, slightly bouffant cavalier. Up close, Gideon was more impressed than ever. The golden third twin was probably the best-looking person she'd ever seen in her life. She was tall and regal with some radiant butterfly quality. Her shirt was haphazardly tucked into her trousers, which were haphazardly tucked into her boots. But she was all topaz and shine and luster. Necromancers affected robes in the same way cavaliers affected swords. But she hadn't tucked her arms into hers, and it was a gauzy gold-shot transparent thing floating out around her like wings. There were about 5 rings on each hand, and her earrings would have put chandeliers to shame. But she had an air of wild and innocent over-decoration, of having put on the prettiest things in her jewelry box and then forgotten to take them off. Her buttery hair was stuck to her forehead with sweat, and she kept tangling a curl of it in one finger and heartlessly letting it go. The second twin was as though the first had been taken to pieces and put back together without any genius. She wore a robe of the same cloth and color, but on her it was a beautiful shroud on a mummy. The cavalier had lots of hair, an aquiline face, and a self-satisfied little jacket. "I think the bright twin was saying that it's a hell of a lot better than sticking us in a room and playing who's the best necromancer, or worse, loading us up with old scrolls and having us translate rituals for hours and hours on end." "Yes, it would have been unfortunate," agreed her sister classically, "considering it would have demonstrated within the first 5 minutes that you're completely sick." A curl was wound about one finger. "Oh, shut it, Iante. We should be celebrating if we're being honest with ourselves." The panicked girl continued, warming to her subject, since the already poorly hidden fact of you being a great big bimbo would have come to light so quickly that it would have broken the sound barrier. The curl was let go with a visual sprawling. "Auntie, don't make me cross. Please don't be cross," said her sister. "You know your brain can only deal with one emotion at a time." The cavalier's expression got ugly. "You're sorry, Auntie," he said sharply. "You can't show off with books. Add in for an item And so you're invisible, isn't that it? Both girls rounded on him at once. The pallid twin simply stared, eyes closed to pale lashed slits. But the lovely twin took one of his ears between a thumb and forefinger and tweaked it unmercifully. He was not a short young man, but she had half a head on him and a whole head if you count her hair. Her sister watched from the side impassive, though Gideon swore that she was smiling very slightly. If you talk like that to her again, perhaps, said the golden twin, I'll destroy you. Beg her forgiveness. He was shocked and defensive. Come on, you know I didn't. Those for you. I was meeting the insult for you. She can insult me as she likes. You're insubordinate. Say you're sorry, princess. I live to serve Nibirius, she said, and pulled his ear forward so that he had to come with it like an animal being led by a bit. Too bright red spots of outrage had formed in his cheeks. The lovely twin waggled his ear gently so that his head shook with it. Grovel, Babs, as soon as possible. Please leave it, Corona, said the other girl suddenly. This isn't the time to horse around. Drop him. Let's keep going. The bright twin Corona hesitated, but then dropped the ear of the unfortunate cavalier. He rubbed it fretfully. Gideon could only see the back of his head, but he kept looking at the girl, who basically clouded him like a whipped dog, the arrogant line of his head and shoulders drooping. Suddenly, impetuously, Corona slung one arm around him and perambulated forward, giving his other ear a tweak. He jerked suddenly away before wheeling him through the doors to the pit room. The pale twin held the door open for them both as they went through, exclaiming at the smell. The pale twin paused. She did not follow them. She looked straight into the darkness, instead the deep shadows around the stairwell. Gideon knew that she was completely hidden, hooded, invisible, but she felt herself pressing backward anyway, away from that pale, washed-out gaze which was staring with discomforting accuracy straight at her. This is not a clever path to start down, she said softly. I would not attract attention from the necromancer of the third house. The pale twins stepped through and closed the door behind her. Gideon was left alone. Chapter 10. Hurlheart did not appear for a midday meal. Gideon, still unused to the concept of midday meal, or honestly midday, appeared a good hour earlier than anyone else would have. Either everyone had an appropriate circadian pattern of hunger, or they were being too housely and well-bred not to follow one. Gideon sat in the hot scrubbed room where she had eaten breakfast and was given a meal of paled white meat and a bunch of leaves. It was good that she was alone. She had no clue what to do with it. She ate the meat with a fork. He didn't need a knife. It was so tender that it flaked away if you touched it, and ate the leaves one by one with her fingers. She realized partway through that it was probably a salad. Raw vegetables in the ninth came in the form of pitiable cans of grated Snow Lake strained through with as much salty black sauce as it would absorb. She filled up on the bread, which was really very good, and stuck a piece in her robe for later. A skeleton had brought her food. A skeleton had taken it away with the same pinpoint accuracy the others had shown. There were no cheap tricks with them. She noticed nobody had jammed pins through the joint so that they'd stick together easier, or slammed on big gobs of tendon. No, whoever had raised them had been extraordinarily talented. She suspected it was teacher Harrow wouldn't like that. The house of the ninth was meant to have cornered the market on perfect reconstruction, and here were a whole bunch of them, probably made by a little man who clapped his hands together unironically just as Gideon had shaken the crumbs off her lap and was rising to leave. Two more novitiates entered when they saw Gideon. Both they and she stopped dead. One of the pair was a worn, knife-faced kid dressed in antiseptic whites and chainmail you could cut with a fork. It was so delicate. He was draped in it, even down to a kilt, which was strange. Necromancers didn't normally wear that type of armor, and he was definitely the necromancer. He had the necromancer build. Pale silk fluttered from his slim shoulders. He gave the impression of being the guy fun sort out for death. He was prim and aesthetic looking, and his companion, who was older, a fair bit older than Gideon herself, had the air of the perpetually disgruntled. He was rather more robust, nuggety, and dressed in chipped bleached leathers that looked as though they'd seen genuine use. At least one finger on his left hand was a gross-looking stump, which she admired. The reason why they had stopped dead was unclear. She had stopped dead because the necromancer was staring at her with an expression of naked hostility. He looked at her as though he had finally come face to face with the murderer of a beloved family pet. Gideon had spent too long in the depths of Dreber not to know when to put scientifically get outy. It was not the first time she had received that look. Sister Lacrimalta had looked at her that way almost exclusively. And Sister Lacrimalta was blind. The only difference in the way that Crux had looked at her was that Crux had managed also to encapsulate a complete lack of surprise, as though she already had managed to disappoint his lowest expectations, and a very long time ago painfully folded in the back of her amygdala. The Reverend Mother and the Reverend Father had also looked at her like that, though in their case their diffidence had been cut through with a phobic flinch, the way you'd look at an unexpected maggot. Please deal with the shadow cultist, said the whey-faced boy who had the deepest, weariest, most repressive voice she had ever heard in her life. Yes, Uncle, said the bigger man. Gideon was raw for a fight. She wanted nothing more than for the cross-faced man in boiled leather to draw on her. He was strong-boned and weathered, deeply creased yellow-brown and yellow coarse all over, next to his almost daintily dressed necromancer in white. He looked dusty and ferocious. He looked tough. Thank God she wanted to fight bloody. She wanted to fight until bone adepts had to be called to put people's feet back on. She knew the price, waking up mummified in aggressive notes, or maybe dying, but didn't care anymore. Gideon was measuring in her mind's eye the length of her rapier to the collarbones of the cavalier opposite. He disappointed her viscerally by standing a few steps away, putting his hands together and bowing over them. To her it was polite, though not apologetic. He had a lighter, rougher voice than his necromancer, somewhat hoarse, like he suffered from a lifelong cold or a smoker's cough. My uncle can't eat with your kind around, he said. Please leave. Gideon had a million questions like your kind, and why do you have such a baby uncle, one the color of mayonnaise, and is your kind people who aren't nephews and who have middle fingers? But she said nothing. She stared him down for a few seconds. He stared back. His face did not hold the same brand of hate, but it held a bullish, deadened expression that seemed to go right through her. If it had been Crux, she would have given him the finger. As it was, she nodded and pushed past with her mind an indignant twirl. Gideon felt awfully suckered by the whole thing. She had longed for the cohort, in part due to being heartily sick of her time alone in the dark. She'd wanted to be a part of something bigger than encroaching dementia and Snow Lake husbandry. What was she now? An unwelcome specter roaming the halls without a necro to pursue the stinging slap in the face that she didn't even have. Harrow still alone, just in better lighting. She has cherished the tiny delusion that the liquor trials would see her being useful for more than spying on conversations and spoiling breakfasts. Even swords, too, would have been a sweet reprise from idleness. It was in this frame of mind, reckless with disappointment, that she pushed her way at random through a collection of dark, empty antechambers, an upper flight of damp brick steps, and then suddenly she found herself outside in a terraced garden. The sun blazed down through a canopy of glass, saw some thick transparent plex. It was admittedly a garden, only in a very sad sense of the word. Wherever the first house grew its food leaves, they didn't grow them here. The salt was thick on each metal strut. The planters were full of shrubby, stunted green things with long stems and drooping blossoms bleached from the thick white light overhead. Weird fragrances rose like heat above them, heavy smells, strange smells. Nothing that grew on the 9th had a real scent, not the moss and spores in its caves, and not the dried out vegetables cultivated in its fields. The plex ended in a genuinely open area where the wind ruffled the wrinkled leaves of some wrinkled old trees, and there, under in warning in the undulating sun, looking like a long-stemmed drooping blossom herself, was Dulcinea. She was entirely alone. Her man Hulk was nowhere to be seen. Lying in a chair, she looked flimsy and tired. Fine lines marked the corners of the eyes and the mouth, and she was wearing a fashionable and inane hat. She was dressed in something light and clingy that she had not yet hawked blood upon. It looked as though she was sleeping, and Gideon, not for the first time, felt a spike of pity. She tried to backtrack, but it was too late. Don't go, said the figure, her eyes fluttering open. Thought so. Hello, Kitty in the 9th. Can you come and put this chairs back up straight for me? I'd do it myself, but you know by now that I'm not well, and some days I don't feel entirely up to it. Can I beg you that favor? There was a fine sheen of sweat on the translucent brow under the frivolous hat, and a certain shortness of breath. Gideon went to the chair and fiddled with the fashioning, immediately emasculated by the difficulty of working out a simple chair latch. The Lady Septimus waited passively for Gideon to pull it flush, smiling at her. With those big gentian eyes. "Thank you," she said. Once she had been propped up, she took the silly hat off her damp fawn-colored curls and set it in her lap, and her expression was somewhat conspiratorial. "I know that you're doing penance and can't talk, so you don't have to figure out how to tell me through charades." Gideon's eyebrows shot up over her sunglasses rims before she could stop them. "Oh yes," said the girl dumpling, "you're not the first ninth nun I've ever met. I've often thought it must be so hard being a brother or sister of the locked tomb. I actually dreamed of being one. When I was young, it seemed such a romantic way to die. I must have been about 13. You see, I knew I was going to die then. I didn't want anyone to look at me. And the ninth house was so far away, I thought I could just have some time to myself and then expire very beautifully alone in a black robe with everyone praying over me and being solemn. But then I found out about the face paint you all have to wear," she added fretfully. "And that wasn't my aesthetic. You can't drape yourself over yourself and fade away beautifully in face paint. Does this count as a conversation? Am I breaking your penance?" "Shake for no and nod for yes." "Good," she said, when Gideon mutely shook her head. "No socks, completely under this mad bubbling riptide." "I love the captive listener. I know you're only doing this because you feel bad for me, and you do look like a nice kid." "Sorry," she added hastily, "you're not a child. But I feel so old right now. Did you see the pair from the fourth house babies? They have contributed to me feeling ancient. Tomorrow I might feel useful, but today is a bad day, and I feel like a gimp." "Take off your glasses, please." "Gideon the ninth, I'd like to see your eyes." At the juxtaposition of Gideon with obedient, many people would have rocked with laughter and gone on chuckling and gurgling for quite some time. But she was hopeless now. In the face of this extraordinary request, she was hopeless. At the thin arms and rosebud smile of the woman girl in front of her, she was utterly helpless. At the word gimp, she slid her sunglasses off her nose and obligingly presented her face for inspection, and she was inspected thoroughly, and immediately the eyes narrowed with intent, and for a moment the face was all business. There was something swift and cool in the blueness of those eyes, some deep intelligence, some sheer shameless depth and breadth of looking. It made Gideon's cheeks flare, despite her mental reproach. "To slow down, nerves slow down, oh singular," said Dulcinea quietly, more to herself than to Gideon. "Hyperchrome recessive. I like looking at people's eyes," she explained, suddenly smiling. "Now they tell you such a lot. I couldn't tell you much about your reverend daughter, but you have eyes like gold coins. Am I embarrassing you? Am I being a creep?" At the head shake, "No." She settled back more into her chair, tilting her head to the seat back and fanning herself with the frivolous hat. "Good," she said with satisfaction. "It's bad enough that we're stuck in this burnt-out old hovel without me scaring you. Isn't it fantastically abandoned? Imagine all the ghosts of everyone who must have lived here, worked here, still waiting to be called. If we could figure out how the seventh doesn't do well with ghosts, you know, we offend them, we worrisome, the old division between body and spirit. We deal too much with the body, crystallizing it in time, trapping it unnaturally. The opposite of your house, don't you think?" "Gideon the ninth, you take empty things and build with them." We pressed down the hand of a clock to try to stop it from ticking the last second. This was all so far over Gideon's head that it sat somewhere out in space, but there was something soothing about it anyway. Gideon had only ever been clotheslined this way, with Harrow Hark, who explained herself seldom, and as you would only to a very stupid child. Dulcinea had the dreamy, confiding manner of someone who, despite spouting great a horseshit, was confident he would understand everything she was saying. Also, as she taught, she smiled widely and prettily and moved her lashes up and down. Thus hypnotized, Gideon could only watch with a mouth full of teeth as the blue-eyed necromancer laid one slight narrow hand on her arm. Her skin stretched in over very marked metacarpals and wrist bones like knots in a rope. "Stand up for me," said Dulcinea. "Indulge me, lots of people do, but I want you to." Gideon pulled away and stood. The sunlight duppled over the hem of her robe and rusty splotches. Dulcinea said, "Draw your sword." Gideon of the ninth, grasping the smooth black grip beneath the black nest of the knuckle bow, Gideon drew. It seemed as though she had drawn this damn thing 1,000 times, that Iglaminay's voice has taken permanent residence in her head now. "Just to keep up the charade, draw, lean on the right forearm, bent, not collapse, naked. Blade angled at your opponent's face or chest. You're guarding the outer side of your body. Nav, you're on your right foot and you're not wading forward like a goddamned piece of freight. You're centered. You can move backward or forward at will. The rapier blade, away from its black home in Dreba, burned a lightless, opaque metal color. A long, slender absence of hue. Gideon acknowledged its beauty grudgingly, how it looked like a needle in ebon ribbon offhand up and high. She relaxed into position, triumphant in the new body memory that her teacher had beaten into her, and wanted to fight again. Oh, very good, so Dulcinea. And she clapped like a child seeing a firework, perfect, just like a picture of Nunnius. People say that all night cavaliers are good for is pulling around baskets of bones. Before I met you, I imagined that you might be some wizarding thing with a yoke and panniers of cartilage, half skeleton. Already this was bigoted assumption of, and completely true. Gideon relaxed her sword and her stance at her ease, and saw that the fragile girl engulfed by her chair had stopped playing with her frivolous hat. Her mouth was quirked in a quizzical little smile, and her eyes said that she had calculated to +2 and ended up with a very final for Gideon. The ninth said Dulcinea slowly, are you used to a heavier sword? Gideon looked down. She looked at her rapier pointed skyward like a black arrow, her offhand cuffed and supporting what should have been more grip, but now was the long knob of pummel, the way you told a fucking long sword. She sheathed it, immediately sliding it home to its scabbard in a tight iron whisper. A cold sweat had broken out beneath her clothes. The expression on Dulcinea's face was simply bright-eyed, mischievous interest. But to Gideon, it was the second Darius bell chiding a child already 10 minutes late for prayer. For a moment, a lot of stupid stuff felt very ready to happen. She nearly confessed everything to Dulcinea's mild and denim-colored gaze. She nearly opened her mouth and begged wholeheartedly for the woman's mercy. It was in this moment of charged stupidity that Pratizelaus turned up, saving her bacon by dint of being very large, and ignoring her, he stood with his muddy hair and blurry skin and blocked the shaft of sunlight that was pattering over his adept's hands. And he said to her in his dreary, rumbling voice, it shut no time to figure out that one. As Dulcinea's eyes flickered between her cavalier and the cavalier of the ninth, Gideon took the opportunity to turn tail and not run, but slope extremely fast in the direction of Anywhere. But there were cracks in the plaques, and the wind was coming in hot and salty, rippling her robes and her hood, and she had nearly escaped when Dulcinea occurred. Kitty in the ninth, she half turned her head back to them, dark glasses crooking down over her eyebrows. Pratizelaus the seventh stared at her with the empty eyes of someone who would watch with equal heavy disinterest if part of the wall were kicked out and she were punted down into the sea. But his adept was looking at her wistfully. Gideon hesitated by the door, for that look in the shadows of the archway buffeted by the wine from the water. Dulcinea said, I hope we talk again soon. Hell, thought Gideon, taking the stairs blindly 2 at a time. She didn't. She had said too much already, and all without speaking a single word. Chapter 11. Those early days at Canaan House spaced themselves out like beads on a prayer string. Dilated, they consisted of big empty hours of eating meals in unoccupied rooms, of being alone amid very strange strangers. Gideon couldn't even rely on the familiarity of the dead. The skeletons of the first were too good, too capable, too watchful, and Gideon didn't feel truly at ease anywhere except shut up in the dim rooms that the ninth had been given doing drills after nearly giving everything away. She spent 2 days almost entirely cloistered, working with her rapier until the sweat had smeared her face paint to a leering staved and mask. She stacked a rusting stool on top of the sagging airborne dresser and did chin UPS into the iron wedge that ran across the rafters. She did press-ups in front of the windows until Dominica slimmed her with bloody light completing its sprint around the watery planet.